This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. The first thing I saw that night wasn't my mother's smile or the anniversary cake. It was the hospital receipt sliding across the polished oak table like a quiet blade. The room was glowing with warm light and polished laughter, the kind that made everything look perfect from the outside. Copenhagen in late spring had that effect on people. The air outside the restaurant windows carried the soft silver of the harbor, and inside the private dining room my parents had rented, the atmosphere was carefully curated. Linen tablecloths, gold-trimmed plates, candles arranged like little monuments to family harmony. Everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. My father sat at the center, leaning back with the easy authority he had spent decades practicing. My mother glowed beside him, basking in the attention that came with celebrating 35 years of marriage. My younger sister Emily laughed easily with cousins who had flown in from Aarhus and Stockholm. And me? I sat near the end of the table, the seat that had silently become mine over the years. Not quite excluded, just strategically distant. The expendable child. It had been that way for as long as I could remember. In family photos, I was always slightly off-center. At holidays, my achievements were briefly acknowledged before the conversation pivoted to someone else. When things went wrong, though, my role became very clear. Absorb the discomfort so the family story could stay polished. The pattern had repeated itself for years, and tonight, judging by the way my mother kept glancing toward me with a rehearsed softness, I knew another performance was about to begin. I had almost declined the invitation. My life had changed a lot since the last time I sat at one of these tables. Copenhagen had given me distance, anonymity, and eventually a career that rebuilt the parts of me my family had spent years quietly sanding down. I was now a partner at a respected accounting firm in the city's financial district. My clients trusted me with corporate restructurings, international tax disputes, and forensic audits that unraveled years of creative bookkeeping. Numbers told the truth. People, on the other hand, preferred stories, and my parents had been rewriting mine for decades. The appetizers arrived with polite choreography. Glasses clinked. Someone made a toast about love and longevity. The conversation drifted between travel plans and childhood memories, most of them polished enough to belong in a family brochure. I watched the room carefully. Years of auditing had trained me to notice the small things. Hesitation before someone spoke, the way hands tightened around cutlery when a subject shifted. My cousin Daniel's wife, Sophia, kept studying me with quiet curiosity. She had married into the family only 2 years ago, which meant she hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules. Emily avoided eye contact entirely. That was interesting. Then my mother stood. She tapped her glass gently, drawing the room's attention with the effortless grace of someone who had spent a lifetime hosting audiences. The room softened instantly. She smiled the way she always did before telling a story about sacrifice. And somehow, I already knew I was about to become the subject. She began with nostalgia. 35 years of marriage, she said. 35 years of raising children, guiding them through difficult moments, supporting them when life became complicated. Her voice carried the warm gravity of a practiced storyteller. People nodded. A few murmured appreciation. Then she shifted the story exactly where she wanted it, toward me. She mentioned the difficult years after my illness, the hospital visits, the financial strain, the way parents sometimes had to carry burdens quietly so their children could rebuild their lives. I felt several heads turn in my direction. The familiar script was unfolding perfectly. In this version of the story, my parents had heroically covered my medical expenses years ago when I was struggling. In this version, they had stepped in when I couldn't manage the costs myself. In this version, their generosity explained why family gatherings always carried a subtle expectation that I should be grateful, compliant, careful not to challenge them. The story had been told many times it had hardened into family mythology. only one problem existed. Every hospital bill had been paid by me. Every single one. I kept my hands folded calmly in front of me while my mother described their supposed sacrifices in gentle, heartbreaking detail. The room reacted exactly the way she expected. Sympathetic smiles, admiring glances toward my parents, a few concerned looks aimed at me, the once troubled child who had needed rescuing. Across the table, Emily shifted in her seat. Daniel's wife tilted her head slightly, the way people do when something doesn't quite line up, and then my father delivered the finishing touch. He lifted his glass with quiet pride and mentioned how grateful he was that they had been able to step in and cover the hospital bills during my recovery. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Because now the story wasn't just nostalgia, it was fact, recorded in front of 20 witnesses over candlelight and champagne. I let the silence breathe for exactly 3 seconds. Then I reached into the slim leather folder resting beside my chair. Years ago, I learned something very important about family narratives. You don't defeat them with arguments, you defeat them with documentation. The folder opened with a quiet rustle. Inside were copies of hospital statements, payment confirmations, and one particular ledger from the billing department of Rigshospitalet. Each payment line carried a name, my name. Across the table, my mother was finishing her speech, glowing under the soft applause of relatives who believed they had just witnessed a touching story about parental devotion. I slid the first receipt gently onto the table. The paper caught the candle light, and for the first time that evening, my mother's smile flickered, because she recognized the hospital logo immediately, and she realized a fraction of a second too late that I hadn't come to Copenhagen tonight to relive old stories. I had come to correct the record. But the receipt wasn't the real surprise waiting for them. The real surprise was what the hospital ledger said about who had been paying for everything, long before anyone at that table realized it. Part 2. The paper rested on the table between the wine glasses and the folded napkins, quiet but impossible to ignore. For a moment, no one spoke. Most people at the table assumed it was just another document related to the story my mother had just told. Something sentimental, maybe. A reminder of those difficult hospital months she had so elegantly described. But my mother knew better. I could see it in the way her fingers paused mid-gesture as she set her champagne glass down. She recognized the hospital letterhead. Rigshospitalet didn't send decorative paperwork. My father leaned forward slightly, the polite host still wearing his public smile. He glanced at the page, clearly expecting something that reinforced the narrative he had just helped present. Instead, his eyes slowed. That subtle change was the first crack in the evening's carefully constructed atmosphere. The receipt was simple. Hospital billing statement, patient name, Patrick Walsh, payment received. Under that line sat a series of dates, each one marked paid in full. And beside every payment confirmation sat the same thing, my signature, not theirs. Across the table, Emily's gaze dropped to the paper. I watched the moment recognition crossed her face like a shadow. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Because Emily had been there during some of those hospital visits years ago. She had sat beside my bed when the doctors explained treatment plans and recovery timelines. She had watched me handle the paperwork afterward while our parents were busy telling relatives how difficult everything had been for them. At the time, I never questioned it. Families, strange dynamics. Everyone played roles. Mine had simply been the quiet one, the one who didn't interrupt when stories drifted slightly away from reality. But silence becomes expensive over time, especially when the story being told quietly rewrites your entire life. My cousin Daniel leaned closer to the document, curiosity replacing politeness. His wife Sophia followed his gaze. She was new enough to the family that she hadn't yet learned when not to look too closely. She read faster than the others. Accountants tend to notice small things in people, and Sophia happened to be an economist. Numbers were her language too. Her eyebrows rose almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that something didn't match the story she had just heard. My father cleared his throat. The sound was controlled, almost casual. He reached toward the paper as if examining it would restore the balance of the room. I watched his expression carefully. 35 years of managing family perception had made him very good at reading audiences. Right now, he was calculating which explanation would preserve the narrative most efficiently. My mother tried first. She leaned slightly forward, her voice still warm but carrying a hint of confusion. Perhaps this was one of the bills before they stepped in, she suggested gently. Hospitals often sent multiple statements, and paperwork could become messy during stressful times. It was a graceful attempt. If no one looked too closely, the explanation might have worked, but Sophia had already turned the page, because the first receipt wasn't alone. The leather folder contained a stack, carefully ordered, chronological. Each page carried the same structure: hospital billing, payment confirmation, my name listed as the payer. The dates stretched across months. Not just one payment, not just two, every single bill. A quiet murmur moved along the table as the documents slowly rotated between curious hands. Cousins leaned in. An aunt adjusted her glasses. Someone whispered that the totals looked substantial. Emily remained very still. My father noticed the shifting atmosphere immediately. That was when his smile sharpened. He gave a soft laugh, the kind people use when a misunderstanding threatens to grow larger than necessary. Of course, the payments would show my name, he explained calmly. Families often handled these things internally. The important part was that they had supported me when I needed it most. It was a clever pivot. Not denying the paperwork, just reframing it. Turning financial responsibility into emotional support. Several relatives nodded slowly. That explanation felt comfortable enough for them. People prefer the version of events that allows dinner to continue peacefully. But accountants develop a very particular relationship with documentation. We learn that the most important information in a ledger is often not the number. It's the pattern. I reached into the folder again. This time, I removed a different document. Not a hospital receipt. A ledger. The hospital's internal billing summary. One of the administrators had helped me retrieve it years ago when I needed full records for an insurance dispute. It listed every charge, every payment, every method of transfer, and most importantly, every account holder associated with those transactions. I placed the ledger beside the receipts. The room quieted again, because even from a distance, the document looked different, more official, more complete. My mother's eyes flicked across the page. Her breathing changed slightly. My father leaned closer, and for the first time that evening, his expression lost its effortless confidence. A hospital ledger leaves very little room for interpretation. Each payment entry included the originating account, the account holder name, the authorization signature. All of them belonged to me. Sophia was the first to speak, not loudly, just thoughtfully. She mentioned that the ledger appeared to show direct transfers from my personal account. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just observational. But observations are dangerous when they begin to contradict long-standing family stories. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My mother's smile returned, though it was now thinner than before. She suggested that financial contributions in families were often complicated. Perhaps I had reimbursed them later, she offered gently. That explanation floated briefly above the table. Then Daniel flipped another page. More payments, more signatures, more account confirmations. All mine. The murmur returned, louder this time. Across the room, the restaurant staff began preparing the anniversary cake near the sideboard, completely unaware that the real centerpiece of the evening had already been served. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. The host's smile returned, but I could see the gears turning behind it. He was searching for a new angle, a new story that could absorb this unexpected detail without losing control of the room. For most of my life, That strategy had worked. Tonight, however, the documents were only the beginning. Because the hospital ledger explained who paid the bills, but it didn't explain why my parents had spent years telling everyone they had. And the answer to that question was sitting in a second folder I hadn't opened yet. One that had nothing to do with hospitals and everything to do with a college fund ledger my parents never expected anyone else to see. Part 3. Silence has a strange texture when it spreads through a room full of relatives. It's not completely quiet. Plates still shift slightly on porcelain. Someone clears their throat. A chair leg scrapes softly against polished wood. But beneath those small sounds, you can feel the collective awareness that something unexpected has entered the conversation. The hospital ledger sat in the center of the table like an object no one quite knew how to move away from. My father looked at it longer than anyone else. He wasn't reading anymore. I could tell. He had already understood the problem within the first few seconds. What he was doing now was measuring the room, calculating how many people had seen enough to start questioning the story they had just applauded. Across from him, my mother folded her hands neatly together. It was a gesture I had seen many times growing up. She used it whenever a conversation drifted somewhere inconvenient. The gesture meant patience, the gesture meant control. But tonight, there was something else in it too, alertness. Daniel slowly slid the ledger towards Sophia again. She skimmed through another page, her expression calm but very attentive. Account numbers, transfer confirmations, timestamps. Accountants recognize certain details instinctively. Economists do too. She understood what she was looking at. Emily still hadn't spoken. Her eyes remained fixed on the tablecloth, as if the pattern in the linen had suddenly become extremely important. My father finally reached forward and tapped the edge of the ledger lightly. He gave a small nod, the way someone does when acknowledging a detail that isn't particularly significant. An impressive record of responsibility, he said with a thoughtful tone. Patrick had always been independent. The pivot was elegant. Instead of challenging the documents directly, he reframed them as proof of my maturity, something admirable that still fit comfortably within the larger family narrative. Several relatives relaxed slightly at that explanation. It felt safer. After all, acknowledging that I had helped manage some payments didn't necessarily contradict the idea that my parents had carried the financial burden overall. Family finances could be complicated, shared, fluid. And my father had always been very good at letting people settle into the explanation that required the least disruption. But Sophia didn't close the ledger. She turned one more page, then another. Finally, she looked up. Her voice was polite but curious. She mentioned that every entry appeared to show direct payment from my account, not reimbursement, not shared billing, direct settlement, even the insurance co-payments, even the pharmacy charges, even the follow-up treatment appointments. Her words drifted gently into the room, but they carried weight. Because once someone says a detail out loud, it becomes harder for everyone else to pretend they didn't notice it. My mother responded immediately. That kind of detail was exactly the sort of thing paperwork often simplified, she explained kindly. Hospitals sometimes recorded transactions in ways that didn't reflect how families actually handled things. She smiled toward Sophia in a reassuring way. New family members often misunderstood these administrative details. Sophia nodded slowly, but she didn't look convinced. I remained quiet. There's a particular advantage to working as a forensic accountant for long enough. You learn that the most effective moment to speak isn't when you first notice the problem. It's when everyone else has already started to notice it themselves. That moment was approaching quickly. My cousin Eric leaned closer to the ledger. He worked in logistics and had always been fascinated by numbers, though not professionally. Still, even he could recognize patterns. He counted silently for a few seconds. Then he leaned back. "That's a lot of payments," he said casually. My father chuckled. "Recovery had taken time," he replied. "Yes," Eric agreed slowly. But the ledger showed something interesting. He tapped one particular column, transfer source. Every payment came from the same account. The room shifted again, because now 3 different people had noticed the same detail. My mother's smile remained intact, but it required slightly more effort to maintain. She glanced toward me briefly. Just a quick look, the kind that silently asked why I was allowing the conversation to drift like this. For years, I would have stepped in immediately to smooth things over. I would have explained that the situation was complicated. I would have reassured everyone that my parents had helped more than the paperwork suggested. I had done exactly that many times before. Tonight, however, I simply watched. My father finally turned toward me directly. His voice remained calm, almost amused. Patrick had always been meticulous with records, he said. That was one of the reasons he had done so well in his career. The compliment sounded sincere, but it carried a quiet instruction beneath it. Close the folder, end the discussion, restore the story. Several relatives looked at me expectantly. This was the moment where I was supposed to nod modestly and confirm that my parents had supported me during a difficult time. That was the role I had played for years. The room waited. Instead, I reached into the leather folder again. This time I removed a small envelope. Not thick, not dramatic, just another piece of documentation. My mother's eyes followed the movement carefully. She still believed this was about hospital bills, about clarifying a misunderstanding. What she didn't realize yet was that the hospital ledger was only the first chapter of the story. The envelope contained something older, something that explained why the myth of my parents paying those bills had been so useful for them. Because years before my illness, another ledger had quietly been keeping track of money that was supposed to belong to me, a college fund ledger. One my parents believed no one outside the family had ever seen. I slid the envelope onto the table beside the hospital documents. My father frowned slightly. He didn't recognize this one. Not yet. Across the table, Emily finally lifted her eyes, and the moment she saw the envelope, the color drained from her face, which told me something important. She remembered exactly what was inside, and she knew that once the room saw it, the story about the hospital bills would suddenly look very different, because the real question wasn't who paid my medical expenses. The real question was where the money that was supposed to pay them had gone in the first place. Part 4. The envelope looked almost harmless, sitting beside the hospital ledger. Plain cream paper. No logo. No official stamp. If someone walked into the room at that moment, they might have assumed it contained something sentimental. An old photograph. Maybe a letter from years ago that someone had decided to share during the anniversary dinner. But Emily knew better. I saw it immediately in the way her shoulders stiffened. People often assume that secrets live in dramatic places, in locked safes or hidden accounts. In reality, they usually live in ordinary objects. File folders, bank statements, envelopes that quietly disappear into desk drawers and are never mentioned again. This particular envelope had once lived in a drawer in my father's home office. I hadn't even been looking for it the day I found it. That was years ago, long before tonight, when I still visited the house regularly and still believed that most family misunderstandings were just that, misunderstandings. The room waited while I slid a finger under the envelope's flap. No one stopped me. Not yet. My father leaned back slightly, watching with careful neutrality. My mother adjusted her napkin on her lap with graceful patience, as if this was still just a minor detour in the evening. But Emily's eyes followed every movement. She knew the order of events that had once led to that envelope being hidden away, and she knew the one person who was never supposed to see it had eventually found it. I opened the envelope slowly and removed a thin stack of photocopied pages. Not many, just enough. Across the table, Daniel leaned forward again, and curiosity pulling him closer. Sophia watched quietly beside him, her analytical expression returning. I placed the first page on the table. It was older than the hospital documents. The paper itself showed slight discoloration at the edges. At the top sat a bank logo from nearly 2 decades ago. Beneath it, a title line, Education Trust Account. Account holder, Patrick Walsh. Several relatives leaned closer instinctively. Education trust funds were not unusual in families like ours. My parents had always been very vocal about planning for our futures. They often spoke proudly about the financial discipline required to set aside money for their children's education. In fact, the story had been repeated many times throughout my teenage years. My father loved telling people that both of his children had college funds waiting for them. It was part of the image he liked to project. Responsible father, thoughtful planner, provider. When I graduated secondary school, I had naturally assumed the account existed, but when the time came to discuss tuition, the explanation changed. Unexpected investments had shifted. Some financial priorities had required adjustment. The fund had been used differently than originally intended. At the time, I accepted the explanation without questioning it too deeply. I simply worked more hours, took on student loans, and eventually built my career the long way. Across the table, Eric studied the document carefully. It clearly showed the account's creation date. Initial deposit, a schedule of contributions over several years. The numbers weren't enormous, but they were substantial enough to cover most of a university education. Sophia traced a line down the page. Her eyes stopped halfway. Then she looked up. The ledger ended abruptly, only a few years after it began. Daniel noticed the same thing. He flipped to the second page. Transaction history, deposits, interest accumulation. Then one very large withdrawal. The room grew quieter, because the withdrawal date was impossible to miss. It happened the same year I was accepted into university, the same year I was told the fund had simply disappeared. My mother shifted slightly in her chair. Her smile had become very controlled now. That account had been restructured years ago, she explained calmly. Financial planning often required adjustments. Her voice carried the same reassuring warmth she used when explaining complex family matters to relatives who didn't want to worry about details. But Sophia was still reading. She turned the page. Then she froze, because the withdrawal line included an authorization signature. The signature belonged to my father. But that wasn't the part that held her attention. The destination account number was listed as well. Transfer recipient, Walsh Family Holdings. My father's private investment account. Daniel blinked slowly. He glanced at the hospital ledger sitting beside it, then back at the trust fund document, then at me. And suddenly the connection began to form. Because if the college fund had been withdrawn years earlier, and if I had later paid every hospital bill myself, then the story my parents had just told about covering my medical expenses didn't simply look exaggerated. It looked necessary. Necessary because without that story, people might start asking what happened to the money that was originally supposed to support me. Across the table, Emily closed her eyes briefly. She had seen the withdrawal happen. Not the paperwork itself, but the argument afterward. The tense conversations behind closed doors. The explanations that followed when I asked why my tuition suddenly required loans. My father cleared his throat again. This time, the sound carried less confidence. Old financial decisions could be complicated, he said carefully. Sometimes funds had to be redirected to stabilize larger family obligations. That explanation might have worked in another room. But in this room sat an economist, 2 engineers, a logistics manager, and a handful of relatives who had now spent several minutes studying actual ledgers. Numbers have a stubborn way of aligning themselves. Sophia looked up slowly. Her voice remained soft but precise. She mentioned that the withdrawal amount from the trust fund was almost identical to the total value of the hospital payments listed in the medical ledger, within a margin of only a few thousand kroner. No one spoke. The candles flickered quietly across the table, because suddenly the timeline looked very different. The college fund had vanished years before my illness, but the amount that disappeared was almost exactly the amount I later paid for my own medical treatment, which meant the story about my parents sacrificing to cover my hospital bills served a very convenient purpose. It explained where that money had gone. Except now the hospital ledger showed they had never actually paid those bills. My father's eyes moved slowly from the trust fund document to the medical receipts, then to me. For the first time that evening, the host's polished confidence wasn't quite strong enough to hide the calculation happening behind it, because he was beginning to realize something important. The envelope hadn't just introduced an old financial record. It had quietly connected two stories my parents had always kept separate. And if anyone at the table asked the next obvious question, the entire family narrative might start collapsing in front of 20 witnesses. And judging by the way Sophia leaned slightly forward again, studying both ledgers side by side, that question was about to arrive. Part 5. For a few seconds, no one asked the question, but everyone in the room had already started forming it. You could see it in the way people leaned slightly closer to the table, in the quiet exchange of glances between cousins who had spent their entire lives trusting the same family stories. The candles flickered softly against the polished glasses. Outside the restaurant windows, the Copenhagen harbor lights shimmered across the water, completely indifferent to the small shift in gravity happening inside the room. Sophia was the one who finally spoke, not abruptly, not accusingly, just carefully. She pointed gently at the college fund ledger first, then at the hospital billing summary beside it. Her voice remained thoughtful. The withdrawal amount from the education trust was roughly the same size as the total hospital expenses years later, she observed. Her finger traced the date of the withdrawal, then the dates of the hospital payments. There was a pause while everyone mentally lined the numbers up. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Eric rubbed his chin. An aunt near the end of the table adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to see the figures again. No one needed to say the conclusion out loud yet. The room could feel it forming. My father spoke before the silence stretched too far. Financial decisions inside a family often looked strange when examined years later, he said calmly. Circumstances changed, investments shifted, priorities evolved. His voice carried the calm authority that had always worked so well at gatherings like this. He had spent decades managing conversations like a skilled conductor. When someone drifted too close to an uncomfortable subject, he simply introduced a more reassuring interpretation. Usually people accepted it. Tonight, however, the table was full of documents, numbers, dates, signatures. Sophia nodded politely at his explanation, but she didn't move the papers away. Instead, she turned one more page of the trust fund records. The final page. This one contained a short notation from the bank officer who processed the withdrawal. Transfer authorized for portfolio consolidation. Destination account confirmed. Signature verified. It was routine language. Administrative. But it confirmed something important. The money hadn't simply vanished through some complex investment adjustment. It had been moved deliberately into my father's private investment account. Years before my university tuition was suddenly declared unfunded. Years before my hospital treatments began. Across the table, Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands folded together in a way that looked very similar to our mother's earlier gesture. Except Emily's hands were trembling slightly. She had always hated moments like this. Moments where the family's carefully managed image started to crack under pressure. My mother leaned forward then. Her voice returned to its warm, guiding tone. The trust account had been restructured to protect the family during a volatile financial period, she explained. It had ultimately benefited everyone. She smiled gently around the table. Families had to make difficult decisions sometimes. The explanation floated briefly above the documents, and for a second, it almost worked. because people want to believe families operate with good intentions. But Daniel looked down again. He tapped the hospital ledger thoughtfully. Then he said something very simple. If the college fund had been withdrawn to protect the family, why did Patrick still end up paying all his hospital bills himself? The room went still again. Not tense, just alert, because now the contradiction was fully visible. The story everyone had heard for years said, my parents had stepped in during my hardest moment, that they had carried the financial burden of my recovery. But the hospital ledger sitting on the table told a very different story. Every payment had come from my account. My father exhaled slowly through his nose. He reached for his glass of water, took a careful sip, and set it back down with measured precision. Then he looked directly at me. Patrick had always insisted on paying his own way, he said with a small, proud smile. The comment was meant to restore dignity to the narrative, to transform the documents into evidence of my independence rather than evidence of something else. But Sophia tilted her head slightly. There was one more detail she had noticed. She turned the hospital ledger back toward the first page and pointed to a small section near the top. Insurance information, primary coverage, patient supplemental account, payment source, personal savings account. But underneath that section was another line. Financial aid request filed. Then, denied. Her finger rested on the rejection stamp. Daniel frowned. He asked quietly why Patrick would have needed to apply for hospital financial assistance if the family had already paid the bills. My mother opened her mouth to answer, but the explanation didn't come immediately this time, because financial aid requests leave their own paper trail, and that trail contained something else. Something the hospital administrator had mentioned years ago when helping me retrieve the billing records. The application had listed family financial support as unavailable, which meant the hospital had evaluated my request under the assumption that no parental funding existed. Across the table, several relatives were now studying the documents much more carefully. The room had reached a strange turning point. No one was raising their voice. No one was accusing anyone directly. But the story my parents had built over years of quiet repetition was beginning to fall apart under its own contradictions. My father could feel it. I could see the shift in his posture. The host, who had entered the evening confident and relaxed, was now leaning slightly forward, watching the table like a chess player studying an unfamiliar board. Because he realized something crucial. The hospital receipts hadn't just embarrassed them. They had opened the door to a much larger conversation, and that conversation now included the missing college fund. My mother reached for the stack of papers then. She gathered them neatly, as if tidying the table would somehow tidy the narrative as well. But before she could slide them back toward me, I gently placed one more document beside them. A single sheet, printed recently. Not from the hospital, not from the bank, from my accounting firm. Across the top sat a familiar phrase, Forensic Financial Summary. Prepared by Walsh & Krogstad LLP, my father recognized the firm's name instantly because it was mine. And when his eyes moved to the bottom of the page and saw the line labeled External Verification Witness, his expression changed for the first time that evening, because sitting quietly near the far end of the table, 2 seats away from my cousin Eric, was a man who had not said a single word all night. A gray-haired gentleman who had attended the dinner as Daniel's business colleague. Until this moment, most of the family assumed he was simply a polite guest. But my father knew him. Everyone in Copenhagen's financial circles knew him. Henrik Madsen, senior auditor for Denmark's National Financial Oversight Board. And the moment my father recognized his face, he understood something that made the situation far more dangerous than a few awkward family questions. Because the documents on the table were no longer just part of a family argument. They were now part of a verified financial record, and Henrik Madsen had been quietly watching the entire conversation unfold. Part 6. The moment my father recognized Henrik Madsen, the temperature of the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No one gasped. No chairs scraped loudly across the floor. The restaurant staff continued moving calmly along the wall, preparing the anniversary cake with quiet professionalism. But inside the circle of our table, the shift was unmistakable. My father's expression remained composed, yet a new level of caution settled behind his eyes. For the first time that evening, he wasn't simply managing a family conversation. He was evaluating risk. Henrik Madsen had been sitting quietly near the end of the table since the dinner began. Daniel had introduced him casually when guests arrived, an old colleague visiting Copenhagen, someone interested in meeting the family. No one had thought much about it, except now my father clearly remembered exactly who Henrik Madsen was. In Denmark's financial community, certain names carry weight the way a signature does on an audit report. Henrik had spent 3 decades investigating discrepancies in corporate accounts, charitable funds, and private investment structures. His job required one skill above all others: recognizing when numbers didn't match the story being told. Henrik had not spoken during the entire discussion about the hospital bills. He had simply observed, the way auditors often do, patiently, collecting information. Across the table, Sophia glanced from Henrik to the forensic summary I had just placed down. Her eyes widened slightly as she connected the details. Daniel noticed too. A faint smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, not amused, but impressed. My father leaned forward slightly. His voice was still calm when he spoke, but the casual warmth from earlier in the evening had disappeared. He greeted Henrik politely, acknowledging him as Daniel's guest. Henrik returned the greeting with a small nod. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just professional courtesy. But the presence of a government auditor sitting quietly at a table full of financial documents changes the atmosphere in subtle ways. My mother sensed it immediately. Her smile remained elegant, but she gently reached for the papers again, as if the conversation had simply too far into tedious administrative territory. She suggested that old financial records were hardly appropriate material for an anniversary dinner. There were guests to entertain, after all. Stories to share, memories to celebrate. It was a graceful attempt to redirect the evening, and under normal circumstances, it probably would have worked. But Henrik cleared his throat softly, not loudly, just enough to draw attention. He wasn't interrupting, he was acknowledging something. His voice carried the calm neutrality of someone used to discussing complex financial matters without emotion. He mentioned that the forensic summary appeared very thorough, professionally prepared. That kind of documentation, he noted, often helped clarify misunderstandings before they turned into more serious disputes. No accusation, no judgment, just an observation, but it landed heavily, because the word forensic meant something very specific in accounting. It meant someone had reconstructed financial history, carefully, methodically. Across the table, Eric leaned forward again, curiosity returning with fresh energy. He asked if the summary simply confirmed what the hospital ledger already showed. I slid the page slightly toward him. Not all of it, just enough for him to read the top section. Forensic Financial Review subject, Patrick Walsh. Medical payment verification. Below that heading sat a clean summary of the hospital transactions, dates, amounts, account numbers, verification stamps, all confirming the same thing the ledger had already revealed. Every medical bill had been paid directly from my personal account, but Eric's eyes moved lower, toward the next section. And that was where the real problem for my parents began. Because the forensic summary didn't stop at the hospital bills, it also included a short analysis titled Associated Historical Financial Movements. Underneath that heading sat a familiar number, the exact withdrawal amount from the Education Trust Fund. Next to it was a timeline comparison chart. Trust fund withdrawal, year 1. Medical treatment period several years later. Hospital payments matching total value. The summary didn't accuse anyone of anything, it simply displayed the numbers side by side. Accountants rarely need dramatic language. Numbers speak clearly enough. Daniel let out a slow breath. Sophia studied the page carefully. Emily stared at her folded hands. And my father remained very still. His mind was moving quickly now. I could see it. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He was calculating exposure, what had been said publicly tonight, what documents were now visible, what witnesses were present. Because in a room full of family members, embarrassment is one thing. But when financial documents begin circulating in front of a government auditor, that changes the stakes. My mother finally spoke again. Her voice remained smooth, but a faint edge had crept into it. Surely this kind of analysis was unnecessary, she said gently. Families sometimes moved money around in ways that made sense at the time. Patrick had always been dramatic about paperwork. The comment was meant to shrink the significance of the documents, to frame the entire situation as an overreaction. But Henrik spoke again, still calm, still polite. He mentioned that the forensic summary appeared to include independent verification of account ownership and transfer authorization. That level of documentation was typically prepared when someone anticipated potential disputes about historical transactions. The room absorbed that quietly, because the implication was obvious. This wasn't a stack of random paperwork. It was a carefully assembled financial record, prepared in advance. My father looked directly at me again. This time the question in his eyes was unmistakable. "How much do you have?" I met his gaze calmly. Years ago, I would have felt nervous in this moment. Years ago, I might have worried about humiliating my parents in front of relatives. But forensic accounting changes your relationship with conflict. When the numbers are clear, emotions become less important. I reached into the leather folder again, not for another ledger, for a small set of signature forms, simple documents, legal language, nothing dramatic. Across the top sat a straightforward title, Family Asset Clarification Agreement. Daniel blinked. Sophia leaned closer again. Eric whispered something under his breath, because suddenly the purpose of tonight's dinner was starting to look very different. My father had believed this was another family gathering where the old narrative would be repeated, and I would quietly play my usual role. Instead, the documents now on the table suggested something else entirely. I hadn't come here to argue. I hadn't even come here to embarrass anyone. I had come for signatures. And judging by the way Henrik Mattsson was now studying the agreement forms with professional interest, my parents were about to realize that the anniversary dinner they planned to control had quietly turned into a financial closing meeting they never expected. Part 7. For a long moment, no one reached for the signature forms. They rested quietly beside the ledgers, their presence far more unsettling than any raised voice could have been. The anniversary dinner had started with champagne and nostalgic speeches. Now the center of the table looked like the middle of a conference room during a financial negotiation. My mother stared at the heading of the document as though it might rearrange itself if she waited long enough. Family Asset Clarification Agreement. The phrasing was careful, neutral, legal, without sounding aggressive. The kind of language accountants and attorneys preferred when they wanted resolution without open conflict. Across from her, my father studied the page in a way I recognized immediately. It was the same expression he used whenever he reviewed investment reports or corporate contracts. Except this time, the numbers were about our family. He finally looked up at me. His voice stayed calm, but the tone had hardened slightly. What exactly was this supposed to be? A fair question. Most of the relatives at the table were wondering the same thing. The room had become very quiet again, but the curiosity was unmistakable. A few cousins leaned closer. Someone near the far end of the table had completely forgotten about their dinner plate. Henrik Mattsson remained seated quietly, his hands folded, observing the room the way experienced auditors often do when discussions start revealing their true structure. I slid the top page a little closer to the center. The document wasn't complicated. It summarized 3 things. First, confirmation that all hospital expenses during my treatment years had been paid personally by me. Second, acknowledgement that the Education Trust Fund originally established in my name had been withdrawn and transferred into Walsh Family Holdings under my father's authorization. Third, a formal clarification that any public statements describing my parents as financially responsible for my medical treatment were inaccurate. Nothing emotional, nothing accusatory, just a correction of the record. Eric read the page first. He didn't say anything immediately, but his eyebrows rose slowly as he reached the final paragraph. Daniel leaned in beside him. Sophia followed. Emily still hadn't moved. Her eyes remained on the tablecloth, though I noticed she was listening very carefully to every word being spoken. My mother gave a quiet laugh. Not mocking, just lightly dismissive. Surely this wasn't necessary, she said. Families didn't need formal agreements to understand each other. The room waited, because everyone present knew that wasn't really the issue. If the story about the hospital bills had simply been a misunderstanding, none of this documentation would have been necessary. But the story had been repeated for years. At birthdays, holiday dinners, even at professional gatherings where my father proudly described how the family had supported me through difficult times. Those stories had created something more powerful than simple exaggeration. They had created reputation. And reputation can become extremely valuable in certain social circles, especially when it paints someone as generous, responsible, and quietly sacrificial. My father tapped the edge of the agreement page with one finger. He had moved past confusion now. He was evaluating strategy. "You're asking us to sign something stating we didn't pay your medical bills," he said carefully. "Not exactly," I replied. The agreement simply confirmed what the hospital ledger already showed. Daniel gave a quiet exhale, because that was technically true. The document wasn't introducing new claims. It was formalizing the information already sitting in front of everyone. My mother's smile faded a little more. Her voice became softer, but firmer. "Patrick, this feels unnecessarily confrontational." There was a hint of warning beneath the gentleness. The same tone she had used throughout my childhood whenever I questioned family decisions too directly. But confrontation had never been the purpose. I explained calmly that the document existed mainly to prevent future misunderstandings. In particular, misunderstandings involving financial responsibility. Across the table, Henrik finally spoke again. Not to challenge anyone, just to clarify something. He mentioned that agreements like this were quite common when historical financial narratives had become inconsistent with documented records. His tone was purely professional. Such documents help protect all parties from potential legal confusion later. My father glanced toward him sharply, because hearing those words from a government auditor made the situation feel far less like a family discussion and far more like a formal matter. Sophia looked thoughtful. She asked a simple question. If the agreement only confirmed the hospital payments, why include the trust fund withdrawal? I nodded slightly. That was the key point, because the trust fund explained the context. Without it, people might assume my parents had simply exaggerated their financial support during my illness. With it, the timeline looked very different. The fund originally created for my education had been removed years earlier. And later, when I faced significant medical expenses, the story presented to the family suggested my parents had stepped in to help. The combination of those two narratives created a very specific impression, one that the documents on the table now contradicted. Emily finally spoke. Her voice was quiet. She asked if signing the agreement meant admitting wrongdoing. The question hung in the air, because everyone understood what she was really asking. I shook my head. The agreement didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It simply corrected the financial narrative going forward. If relatives ever referenced the hospital bills again, the documented truth would be clear. My father leaned back in his chair slowly. His expression had changed again. He wasn't angry, not yet, but the realization was settling in. The evening he had expected to control was slipping out of his hands, because arguments could be dismissed. Emotional conflicts could be reframed, but documents signed in front of witnesses carried a different kind of weight. He looked around the table at the relatives who had just spent the last 20 minutes studying ledgers and forensic summaries. Then his eyes returned to the agreement form. "You planned this," he said quietly. I didn't answer immediately, because technically he was right, but not in the way he thought. Years earlier, when I first discovered the trust fund withdrawal, I hadn't planned any confrontation at all. I had simply started keeping records. Accountants develop that habit naturally. Documentation becomes a form of patience. You collect the numbers, you verify the dates, you wait until the story being told drifts far enough away from the evidence that correction becomes inevitable. Tonight wasn't revenge. It was closure. And that was when the restaurant staff began rolling the anniversary cake toward the table. 35 candles glowing softly, a symbol of celebration arriving at exactly the wrong moment. Because my parents had spent weeks planning this dinner to reinforce the story of their devoted marriage and supportive family. Now the cake was about to be cut in a room where half the relatives were staring at financial records instead of the candles. And my father was slowly realizing something far more dangerous than embarrassment. If he refused to sign the agreement, the documents on the table could still leave this room. And once they did, the story about who had really paid for everything might start circulating far beyond our family. Part 8. The cake arrived glowing like a centerpiece for a celebration that no longer existed. 35 candles flickered across white frosting while the restaurant staff placed it gently on a stand beside the table. A few relatives instinctively began clapping softly out of habit, the way people do when a milestone moment is supposed to happen. But the applause faded quickly, because half the table was still staring at ledgers. The other half was watching my parents. And the anniversary cake now looked less like a symbol of celebration and more like an awkward interruption in the middle of a financial reckoning. My mother stood slowly, smoothing her dress with a practiced gesture. She had hosted hundreds of dinners over the years. Social situations were her territory. Even when something went wrong, she knew how to guide the room back toward normalcy. This was simply another situation to manage. She thanked the staff warmly and suggested everyone gather closer for the traditional cake cutting. Her voice carried the same graceful confidence it always had. For a moment, several relatives almost obeyed automatically. Ritual has power. Family habits have gravity. But the documents sitting in the center of the table were heavier than tradition tonight. Daniel didn't move. Sophia didn't move. Eric leaned back in his chair, arms folded loosely, studying the signature forms again. Even Emily remained seated. The cake waited patiently beside the table, candles burning lower. My father looked from the cake to the documents and then around the room. He understood something important in that moment. The celebration had lost control. The room's attention had shifted, not dramatically, just decisively. My mother noticed it too. She sat down again slowly, the hostess' smile returning, though it required more effort now. Patrick had always had a dramatic flair for paperwork, she said lightly, trying once more to shrink the situation back into something small and mildly amusing. Several relatives smiled politely, but the laughter didn't come, because people had already seen too much. Numbers create a certain kind of clarity. You can argue about intentions, but you can't easily argue about signatures and transfer dates. Across the table, Henrik Madsen quietly turned the agreement page toward himself. He didn't touch the pen, he simply read it. That gesture alone carried weight. When an auditor studies a document in silence, people tend to pay attention. My father watched him carefully. The calculation behind his eyes was becoming sharper now. He knew exactly what Henrik's presence meant. This conversation was no longer purely private, not legally, not socially. Daniel finally spoke again. He tapped the line on the agreement referring to the trust fund. His voice remained calm. He asked if the document required repayment of the withdrawn funds. My mother reacted immediately. "Of course not," she said. The idea sounded almost ridiculous. The trust account had been family money to begin with. Her tone suggested that everyone at the table should already understand this. But Sophia tilted her head thoughtfully. The account name listed Patrick Walsh as the beneficiary, she pointed out. Education trust accounts were normally structured for a specific purpose. If the funds had been withdrawn and used elsewhere, clarification might be necessary. The conversation had moved fully into financial territory now. Exactly the kind of discussion my father usually dominated, except this time, the documents weren't his. The narrative wasn't his, and the room was slowly realizing that. Emily looked up again, her voice hesitant. "If the agreement didn't ask for repayment," she asked, "then why sign it?" The answer was simple: reputation. But I didn't say that immediately. Instead, I explained calmly that the agreement existed primarily to correct public statements that had been made over the years. Statements suggesting my parents had covered my hospital expenses. Statements that had quietly shaped how relatives, business contacts, and social acquaintances understood our family dynamics. Once the agreement was signed, those statements would simply stop being repeated. The truth would be documented. No accusations, no public confrontation, just accuracy. Eric leaned forward slightly. "So this was about reputation after all," he said. "Not about money." I nodded, mostly, because the money had already been spent years ago. But stories about money tend to linger, and those stories can influence other things. Professional credibility, family influence, trust. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He finally reached for the agreement form. The room watched closely. For a second, it looked as though he might simply sign it and end the matter. But instead, he turned the page slowly and studied the final paragraph. Then he set the paper back down. His voice was still calm when he spoke, but there was steel in it now. "You're asking us to sign something implying we lied to our own family for years." The room absorbed the sentence quietly, because once spoken that way, the situation sounded far more serious. My mother nodded gently beside him, reinforcing the idea. "Misunderstandings happened in families," she said, "but formalizing them like this felt unnecessarily harsh." Across the table, Henrik finally placed his hand lightly on the document, not claiming it, just acknowledging it. He spoke with the same neutral tone he had used all evening. The agreement did not use the word lie anywhere, he noted. It simply stated that the hospital payments had been made by Patrick Walsh, which the ledger appeared to confirm. The room remained silent, because technically he was correct. My father looked at me again, longer this time, trying to measure something. Perhaps how far I was willing to push this. Perhaps whether I would back down the way I always had before. For most of my life, that expectation had been safe. But people change when they spend enough years rebuilding themselves. Finally, he asked the question that had been hovering beneath the entire evening. "What happens if we don't sign it?" Several relatives shifted slightly in their seats, because now the situation had reached its real turning point. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply answered honestly. Then the forensic summary and supporting documents would be filed with our firm's records for professional completeness, a routine archival step. But because the analysis involved multiple financial institutions, independent verification witnesses, and documented family financial representations, those records could become accessible if questions about the narrative ever surfaced again. Daniel blinked slowly. Sophia looked toward Henrik. Even Emily's breathing became a little quieter, because everyone at the table understood what that meant. The story about my parents paying my hospital bills had circulated for years in social and professional circles. If the documents correcting that story ever surfaced in the same circles, the embarrassment would extend far beyond this dinner. My father leaned back again. For the first time that evening, the confident host who had expected to control the narrative was completely still. He looked at the anniversary cake. The candles had burned almost halfway down now. Wax had begun dripping slowly across the frosting. The celebration he had planned was still technically happening. But the story of the evening had changed. And for the first time in decades, he was no longer the one deciding how it ended. Because the documents sitting on the table had quietly transferred that power to someone else. And I hadn't even opened the final page of the agreement yet. Part 9. The candles on the anniversary cake were beginning to bend under their own heat. Small drops of wax slid slowly down toward the frosting, leaving pale streaks across the surface. The staff member who had rolled the cake in earlier hovered near the wall, politely uncertain whether the celebration was still supposed to continue. No one at the table was looking at the cake anymore. Everyone was watching my father, because the question he had just asked, what happens if we don't sign it, had shifted the evening from quiet revelation to quiet negotiation. And negotiations have rules. Silence is one of them. I let the room breathe after my answer, not as a tactic, just as a habit. In forensic accounting, rushing people rarely reveals anything useful. Waiting does. My father tapped the agreement form again, slower this time. He wasn't reading it anymore, he was weighing it. Across the table, Eric leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered something under his breath. Daniel gave a faint nod. Sophia remained still, her eyes moving between the trust fund ledger and the forensic summary like someone comparing two columns of a spreadsheet. Emily looked tired now, not shocked, not angry, just exhausted. Years of quiet family tension have a way of doing that to people who sit in the middle. My mother finally spoke again. Her tone had changed just subtly. The warmth was still there, but it now carried something firmer underneath. Patrick, she said gently, surely you understand how this feels. The implication was clear. Public humiliation, family betrayal, disrespect. These were the emotional currencies she had always used when control slipped away. But I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I turned the agreement page over. There was one more section, a short addendum at the bottom. Several relatives leaned forward instinctively, because by now, everyone had learned that each new page tended to explain something the previous ones had only hinted at. The addendum was brief. It clarified that the agreement would remain a private family document unless any future public statements misrepresented the financial history described within it. If that happened, the agreement could be used to correct the record. Nothing aggressive, just preventative. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's essentially a reputation insurance policy, he said quietly. Sophia nodded beside him. Exactly. My father read the paragraph twice. Then he looked up. So this entire exercise exists to prevent us from repeating the hospital story again. The way he said hospital story made the phrase sound smaller than it actually was, but everyone at the table now understood the scale of it. For years, that story had shaped how relatives saw our family dynamics. It had framed my parents as generous protectors during my recovery, and it had quietly positioned me as the child who had needed rescuing. Correcting that narrative didn't just adjust a detail. It reversed an entire emotional structure. Emily looked at me carefully. Her voice was hesitant when she spoke. Why didn't you say something sooner? The question wasn't defensive. It was genuine. Several relatives glanced at me with the same curiosity, and it was a fair question. The documents on the table could have surfaced years earlier. The hospital receipts had existed all along. The trust fund records had been accessible for a long time. I could have confronted my parents at any family dinner in the past decade, but I hadn't. I explained calmly that correcting a story too early rarely works. People protect narratives they've repeated for years. If I had challenged the hospital story right after it first appeared, Most relatives would have assumed I was exaggerating or misunderstanding something. Stories have momentum. They need time to drift far enough from the truth where people are ready to notice the difference. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. That sounded exactly like something a forensic accountant would say. Henrik nodded slightly in agreement. It was also something auditors observed frequently. Across the table, my father remained still, but his eyes were sharper now. Because he realized what I had just admitted. I hadn't gathered these documents recently. I had been collecting them quietly for years. The hospital ledger, the trust fund withdrawal records, the forensic verification summary, all assembled patiently, waiting. My mother folded her hands again. That familiar gesture of composure had returned. "You've clearly put a great deal of effort into this," she said softly. The words were neutral, but the meaning beneath them wasn't. "You planned this." I didn't argue. Planning is simply another word for preparation. Eric leaned back in his chair. "You invited an auditor to a family dinner," he said. Daniel raised a hand quickly. To be fair, Henrik came as my guest. Henrik himself gave a small shrug. He had simply accepted an invitation to dinner. But now that he had seen the documents on the table, he acknowledged that the situation had become professionally interesting. That phrase carried quiet weight. Professionally interesting. My father noticed it too. His gaze moved from Henrik to the forensic summary again, then back to the agreement form. For years, he had relied on reputation to stabilize situations like this. But reputation depends on something fragile: consensus. If enough people in the room begin to doubt the narrative, reputation shifts. Slowly at first, then all at once. He looked around the table, at cousins who had just learned new details about the trust fund, at relatives who had watched the hospital ledger circulate from hand to hand, at Daniel and Sophia quietly comparing figures again, at Henrik Madsen sitting calmly with the patience of someone accustomed to long financial investigations. My father finally picked up the pen. The room held its breath slightly, but he didn't sign. Instead, he asked one more question. His voice was steady. "What exactly do you gain from this, Patrick?" "Not money, not revenge." "So what?" For a moment, no one moved, because the question sounded simple, but it cut directly to the heart of the evening. I looked at the hospital receipts, then the trust fund ledger, then the agreement form waiting quietly beside them. Finally, I answered. Accuracy. That was all. The room absorbed the words slowly. Accuracy doesn't sound dramatic, but in families built on carefully managed stories, it can be more disruptive than anger. My father studied my face for several seconds, trying to decide whether accuracy was really the only thing at stake. And judging by the way his grip tightened slightly around the pen, he wasn't entirely convinced. Part 10. My father held the pen in his hand, but the tip never touched the paper. He turned it slowly between his fingers instead, the way people do when they are thinking several moves ahead in a situation that no longer feels predictable. The room watched him without speaking. The candles on the anniversary cake had burned low now. Two of them leaned sideways, their flames flickering unevenly as small rivers of wax slid across the frosting. The cake itself had become a quiet symbol of how badly the evening had drifted from its original plan. My mother glanced at it once, briefly. Then she returned her attention to the documents. Her posture remained composed, but I could see the effort behind it. For someone who had spent a lifetime controlling social situations, losing the emotional rhythm of her room was unsettling. Still, she tried one more time. "Patrick," she said softly, "you say this is about accuracy." She gestured lightly toward the stack of documents. "But surely accuracy doesn't require humiliating your parents in front of family." There it was again. Not anger, not denial, just the quiet repositioning of the conversation into emotional territory. Several relatives shifted slightly in their seats. The idea of humiliation always lands heavily in family gatherings. No one wants to feel like they're participating in something cruel. But Sophia spoke before anyone else could respond. Her voice remained calm. She pointed toward the hospital ledger again. "These records weren't created tonight," she said. "They existed long before this dinner." Then she looked toward my parents. The real question, she added gently, was why the story about who paid those bills had been told differently for so many years. The room went quiet again, because Sophia had framed the issue perfectly. This evening hadn't created the contradiction, it had only revealed it. My father set the pen down for a moment. His expression had shifted into something more analytical now. The emotional arguments weren't working the way they usually did. The room had seen too many documents, so he changed strategies. "You're an accountant, Patrick," he said calmly. "You understand that financial decisions inside families can be complicated. Funds move, accounts change, intentions evolve." The phrasing was careful, not denying anything directly, just suggesting that the situation was too complex to be summarized by a single agreement. Eric leaned forward again. "Then why tell people you paid the hospital bills?" The question landed harder than anyone expected, because it came from someone who rarely involved himself in family disputes. My father's jaw tightened slightly. He looked at Eric for a long moment before answering. Sometimes people simplify stories when explaining difficult periods in their lives. It was a clever answer, technically possible, emotionally understandable. But the problem with simplified stories is that they tend to leave traces behind, and those traces were now sitting on the table. Daniel tapped the forensic summary again. The hospital payments were very clear. He glanced toward me, and the trust fund withdrawal was very clear too. He looked back at my father as to ask, "So, what exactly was simplified here?" My mother's fingers tightened slightly around her napkin. She could feel the direction of the conversation now. The room was no longer asking whether the documents were accurate. They were asking why the story had been different. Emily finally spoke again. Her voice was quiet but steady. The college fund argument had been awful, she said. Every head turned toward her. Because Emily rarely talked about family conflicts openly, she kept her eyes on the table while she continued. She remembered the year the account disappeared, the tension in the house, the explanation that the money had been needed for family investments. She also remembered something else. After Patrick got sick, she said softly, people kept praising our parents for paying the hospital bills. Emily lifted her eyes slowly, and no one ever corrected them. The room absorbed that quietly, because that one sentence carried years of silence inside it. My father inhaled slowly through his nose. Emily had just confirmed something important. The story hadn't been a one-time misunderstanding. It had been repeated, again and again, in front of relatives, friends, business associates. My mother spoke again, but the calm confidence from earlier had thinned noticeably. Families sometimes allow certain impressions to stand because correcting them would only reopen old wounds, she said. It sounded reasonable, even compassionate. But Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Except the impression benefited the parents," she said gently, "not the child who actually paid the bills." Daniel let out a low breath, because the pattern had become obvious now. The trust fund vanished. Years later, the hospital story appeared, and that story conveniently painted my parents as generous providers instead of people who had redirected money originally meant for me. My father picked up the pen again. He stared at the agreement form for several seconds. Then he looked at me. "You planned this dinner reveal very carefully," he said. His tone wasn't angry. It was almost respectful, like a businessman acknowledging a well-constructed negotiation. I shook my head slightly. I hadn't planned the reveal. They had. My parents had chosen this dinner. They had chosen to tell the hospital story again. All I had done was bring the documentation. Henrik Mattsson nodded faintly. From an auditor's perspective, he said calmly, "The timing of disclosures often depends on when inaccurate statements are repeated." The room turned toward him. He continued in the same neutral tone. "If the hospital story had not been mentioned tonight, these documents might have remained in a file somewhere. the stack. But once the narrative was presented publicly again, he gestured lightly toward the agreement. Clarification became reasonable. My father stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed quietly. Not amused, just acknowledging something inevitable. He finally understood the trap. The evening had been built around a story, and the moment that story was told again, the evidence correcting it had been introduced. No raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just documents. He looked down at the agreement form one last time. The pen hovered above the signature line. Across the table, every relative watched. Because everyone knew that once the ink touched the page, the story that had defined our family dynamic for years would officially collapse. But before my father could move the pen, my mother reached out and gently placed her hand over the document, and the look she gave him made it very clear she was not ready to let that happen yet. Part 11. My mother's hand rested lightly over the agreement, but the gesture carried the quiet authority of someone who had controlled family decisions for decades. My father stopped moving the pen, not because she held it down, her touch was gentle, but because he understood the signal immediately. Wait, the room noticed it too. Small gestures inside families often communicate more clearly than words, and everyone at the table had seen that particular look from my mother before. It was the look she used when a conversation was drifting somewhere she wasn't ready to allow yet. The pen hovered just above the paper. Then my father slowly leaned back in his chair again. The signature line remained blank. My mother withdrew her hand and folded both of them neatly in front of her. The calm composure had returned to her posture, but there was a new sharpness behind her eyes now. For most of the evening, she had been trying to soften the situation. Now she was studying it, carefully. "Patrick," she said after a moment, "your documentation is very thorough." The compliment sounded sincere. And in a strange way it was. My mother had always appreciated preparation when it served her purposes. Tonight, she was acknowledging the level of planning that had gone into assembling the records on the table. But compliments from her rarely arrived without a second layer. "You've clearly spent years gathering these documents," she continued. The relatives around the table listened closely, because that observation shifted the narrative again. It suggested patience, strategy, intent. Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. "That's what forensic accountants do," he said. "They build timelines." Henrik nodded faintly. "True." My mother looked directly at me. "And when someone spends that long preparing evidence," she said softly, "it usually means they expect a specific outcome." The room waited. Her meaning was clear. What outcome had I been waiting for all these years? I considered the question carefully before answering. "Closure," I said. The word sounded simple, but it landed heavily. Emily closed her eyes for a moment when she heard it. Because closure inside families rarely arrives cleanly. My father picked up the pen again, though he still didn't sign. "Closure for whom?" he asked. "For me," I replied. Eric shifted slightly in his chair. That answer made sense to him, to most people at the table actually. Years of being quietly portrayed as the struggling child who needed rescuing would eventually wear on anyone. But my mother wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly. "Closure normally happens in private conversations," she said. "Not at anniversary dinners." The sentence floated gently across the table. But its purpose was obvious. She was reframing the evening again, trying to transform it from a factual correction into something that looked socially inappropriate. Several relatives glanced at each other uncertainly, because part of them understood what she meant. Family conflicts were usually handled behind closed doors. Yet another part of them had just watched two financial ledgers dismantle a story they had believed for years. Daniel spoke before the hesitation grew stronger. "The story was told publicly tonight," he pointed out, which meant the correction also happened publicly. My mother gave him a polite smile. "Perhaps. But there were still questions," she said. Then she turned back toward me. "Patrick, if the hospital payments came entirely from your account," she asked calmly, Where did the money come from? The room froze, because that question introduced a new direction, a dangerous one. Several relatives immediately began calculating. Hospital treatment in Denmark was partially covered by the national system, but specialized procedures and private care could still become expensive. The ledger totals sitting on the table reflected that. Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. Sophia looked intrigued. Emily looked nervous, because she knew exactly where this conversation was heading. I answered honestly. Savings, professional income, loans during the early months, the same way many people pay unexpected medical costs. My mother nodded slowly. Then she asked the question she had clearly been building toward. So the trust fund withdrawal had nothing to do with the hospital payments? The room went completely still, because suddenly the narrative was shifting again. If the trust fund money had been used for family investments years earlier, and if I had still paid the hospital bills myself, then perhaps the two stories were not directly connected after all. Perhaps the ledger comparison earlier had only created an unfortunate coincidence. My father looked up quickly. For the first time that evening, a spark of hope appeared in his eyes, because my mother had just opened a small door, a way to separate the trust fund from the hospital narrative. If those two events could be disconnected, then the entire evening might collapse back into a misunderstanding about paperwork. Daniel noticed the shift. He frowned slightly. Sophia looked at the forensic summary again. Eric leaned closer to the documents. Henrik remained silent. And Emily stared at me with quiet dread, because she remembered something the others didn't. Something that had happened the year the trust fund disappeared. Something that explained why the withdrawal amount and the hospital payments looked so eerily similar. My mother waited patiently for my answer. She believed she had finally found the weak point in the timeline. If I admitted the hospital bills had been paid with money I earned later, then the trust fund withdrawal might become irrelevant. The entire confrontation might lose its foundation. The room held its breath. I looked down at the forensic summary again, then at the trust fund ledger, then at my parents. And finally, I said something that caused the fragile sense of recovery in my father's expression to disappear immediately. The trust fund money had nothing to do with paying the hospital bills, but it had everything to do with why I needed loans when the treatment started. Because the account that disappeared years earlier was the same account I had expected to rely on when my life suddenly became very expensive. Part 12. The room absorbed my answer slowly. It didn't arrive with the sharp impact of a revelation. Instead, it spread quietly through the table like a realization people wished they had reached earlier. My mother had tried to separate the trust fund from the hospital bills. Technically, she was right. The money withdrawn from the education account hadn't directly paid my medical expenses. But that wasn't the point. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead thoughtfully, because the logic was simple once you looked at it from the right angle. If the college fund had still existed, then when the hospital treatments began, I would have had access to a substantial financial cushion. Instead, the account had been emptied years earlier, which meant when the medical crisis arrived, I started from zero. Loans, savings, whatever income I could gather at the time. Across the table, Sophia was already doing the math in her head. The timing lined up almost perfectly. The fund vanished shortly before Patrick entered university. Patrick financed his education through work and loans. Several years later, a serious medical issue appeared, and at that point, there was no financial reserve waiting. She spoke the conclusion gently. The missing fund didn't pay the hospital bills, but if it had still been there, Patrick probably wouldn't have needed loans during treatment. Emily closed her eyes again, because that was exactly what she had been afraid someone would say out loud. My father exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen the shift happen. The small door my mother tried to open had closed again. Not dramatically, just logically. My mother still held her composure, but I could see the calculation continuing behind her expression. She wasn't finished. Families face many unexpected financial pressures, she said calmly. The trust account had been redirected during a difficult period. The implication was clear. The withdrawal had been necessary, responsible even. But Daniel lifted the final page of the trust ledger again. His finger rested on the transaction description. Portfolio consolidation, destination account, Walsh Family Holdings. That wasn't exactly an emergency expense, he said. More like an investment move. Eric nodded slightly. And if the investment did well, the money stayed in the family anyway. Right? My father didn't answer immediately, because that question carried a dangerous follow-up. If the investment succeeded, then why was the hospital story needed later? Why present the image of parents sacrificing financially for their child? My mother finally sighed quietly. It wasn't dramatic, just the sound of someone acknowledging that the conversation had reached a place she could no longer redirect easily. Patrick, she said softly, families make decisions based on what they believe will benefit everyone. The phrase everyone hung gently in the air. I didn't challenge it directly. Instead, I reached for the forensic summary again and turned it toward the table. There was a section most people hadn't noticed yet. A timeline column. Trust fund withdrawal, year 1. Walsh Family Holdings expansion, year 2, year 4. Hospital treatment period, year 6. Daniel noticed the second line immediately. Walsh Family Holdings expansion. He looked toward my father. The investment did well then? My father's silence answered the question before words did. Henrik Madsen spoke again, his tone still neutral, but precise. Public investment records confirmed that Walsh Family Holdings had experienced significant growth during that period. It had been mentioned in several financial publications at the time. Several relatives turned toward my father with new interest, because the story was changing shape again. The trust fund money hadn't vanished into a failed gamble. It had helped fuel a successful investment expansion, which meant the account originally created for my education had ultimately increased the family's wealth. But the hospital bills had still been paid by me. Sophia leaned back slowly. That means the family gained the investment growth, while Patrick carried the medical debt. No one responded. Because the math was brutally simple, Emily whispered something under her breath. It sounded like "I'm sorry," though she didn't raise her head when she said it. My father finally placed both hands flat on the table. His patience was thinning now. Investment decisions cannot always be judged years later by people who weren't involved in them, he said firmly. His voice remained controlled, but the calm confidence from earlier had disappeared. For the first time that evening, frustration was visible. Daniel didn't argue, but he did glance back at the agreement form, which simply confirmed the hospital payments. Nothing about investment strategy, nothing about the trust fund's purpose, just one very specific correction of the narrative. My mother noticed that glance. She looked at the agreement again, then at the relatives around the table. And I saw the moment she understood something important. The trust fund discussion had already damaged the story. But the agreement itself was much narrower. It didn't accuse them of taking the fund. It didn't demand repayment. It only corrected the hospital narrative, which meant signing it would end the evening without reopening the larger financial debate. Her eyes moved slowly toward my father. A silent conversation passed between them. He saw it, understood it, and for a second, it looked like he might finally sign. The pen lifted again. The room leaned forward slightly, but before the tip touched the paper, Emily spoke one more time. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something else." Every head turned toward her. Emily rarely interrupted, and the tension in her voice was unmistakable. She looked at my parents nervously, then at me, then back at the documents. "I didn't know if Patrick had the rest of the records," she said quietly, "but the year the trust fund was moved," she swallowed carefully, "there was another transfer too." My father's head snapped toward her instantly. Emily stopped speaking, because the look he gave her was enough to freeze the entire table. Not anger exactly, something sharper, a warning, but it was already too late. Daniel leaned forward slowly. Another transfer? Emily hesitated. The room waited. And for the first time that evening, I realized there might be one piece of the financial story I hadn't uncovered yet. Because Emily's next sentence had the potential to change the entire conversation again. And judging by the sudden tension in my father's posture, he knew exactly what she was about to say. Part 13. Emily had always been the quiet one in our family. Not invisible, exactly, just careful. Careful about what she said, careful about when she said it, and most of all, careful about when she stayed silent. Growing up, that caution had protected her. Tonight, though, it had finally cracked. The moment the words "another transfer" left her mouth, the entire table shifted toward her like a compass needle finding north. My father reacted instantly. It wasn't loud. He didn't raise his voice, but the look he gave her stopped the room colder than any shout could have. Emily fell silent. Her fingers twisted together nervously in her lap, and for a second I thought she might retreat back into that familiar, quiet role she had lived in for years. My mother noticed the hesitation and moved quickly. "Emily," she said gently, "this evening has already become unnecessarily complicated." The sentence was smooth, polished, and practiced. An exit ramp, a way for Emily to step back from whatever she had been about to reveal. But the problem with an almost confession is that once people hear the beginning of it, their curiosity becomes difficult to contain. Daniel leaned forward. "Another transfer from the trust fund account?" he asked. Emily shook her head quickly. "No, that wasn't what she meant." The correction only made the room more alert. Because if it wasn't from the trust fund itself, then what account had been involved? Sophia spoke softly. "Where did the transfer come from?" Emily glanced at my father again, then at my mother. The hesitation stretched across several long seconds, and in that silence I realized something important. Emily wasn't afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of being right. I tried to keep my voice calm when I spoke. "Emily," I said, "it's okay." But even as I said it, I knew reassurance probably wouldn't be enough. Because whatever she was remembering clearly involved something our parents had never intended the family to discuss. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. The movement looked relaxed, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. "Old financial details can be confusing when remembered years later," he said calmly. His tone carried the quiet authority of someone trying to close a conversation before it opened fully. Emily nodded faintly, as if that explanation might allow her to retreat. But Daniel had already noticed something. He tapped the trust fund ledger again. "The withdrawal went into Walsh Family Holdings," he said. "So the other transfer Emily mentioned, that came from the investment account?" The question hung in the air. Emily swallowed. Her voice came out very softly. "Yes." The room went still again. Because now the timeline was shifting in a new direction. The trust fund withdrawal had moved money into the investment portfolio. But Emily was saying that later, some of that money had moved somewhere else. My father's expression hardened. "Emily," he said quietly, but she continued anyway. "Not all of it," she said quickly, "just part." Daniel leaned closer. "Where did it go?" Emily hesitated again. Then she said something that made several relatives glance instinctively toward my sister before she even finished the sentence. "It went to help with my graduate program." The room absorbed the words in silence, because suddenly a new pattern was visible. The trust fund originally created for me had been withdrawn, invested, and later a portion of that investment had been used to support Emily's postgraduate education. Emily hurried to explain. She hadn't known where the money originally came from at the time. Our parents had simply told her they had arranged funding for her program abroad. She thought it was family savings or profits from the investment portfolio. Her voice became smaller as she continued. "I didn't find out about the connection until later." Daniel leaned back slowly. "Sophia, rubbed her temple thoughtfully, because the numbers were rearranging themselves again. Trust fund created for Patrick. Trust fund withdrawn. Investment account expanded. Later transfer helps fund Emily's graduate program. Meanwhile, Patrick pays for university himself. Then, later pays his own medical bills. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't angry. It was mathematical. Eric finally broke it. So Patrick's college fund helped pay for Emily's education. Emily shook her head quickly. Not entirely. Just part of it. But the distinction didn't soften the realization, because the original account had still been created under one name, mine. My mother finally spoke again. Her voice had become firmer. Family resources are sometimes redistributed based on circumstances, she said. Patrick was already financially independent when Emily began her graduate studies, which meant supporting her made sense at the time. The explanation sounded logical, but Daniel glanced at the hospital ledger again. Patrick became financially independent because the fund disappeared, he said quietly. Not before. The room went still again. Emily looked like she wanted the floor to open beneath her chair. I realized something in that moment. She hadn't intended to expose this part of the story tonight, but once the documents began surfacing, she couldn't pretend she didn't remember. My father's patience finally snapped, though not in the way people might expect. He didn't shout, he didn't slam his hand on the table. Instead, he reached calmly for the agreement form again, picked up the pen, and signed his name. The scratch of ink across paper sounded louder than any argument. My mother stared at him, but he didn't stop there. He slid the pen across the table toward her. Your turn, he said quietly. For a moment, she looked genuinely surprised. Then her gaze moved slowly across the room, at the relatives watching, at Henrik Madsen sitting silently with professional interest, at the hospital receipts, the trust fund ledger, the forensic summary, and finally back at the agreement. If she refused now, the evening would continue unraveling. More questions would follow. More financial details might surface. Signing the agreement didn't fix everything, but it stopped the bleeding. She picked up the pen slowly. Her signature followed his. 2 clean lines of ink across the bottom of the page. Daniel exhaled quietly. Eric leaned back in his chair. Emily looked like she might cry. The agreement was done. The story about the hospital bills was officially over. But as I gathered the documents together, one thought lingered in my mind. Emily had only mentioned one additional transfer, and if the investment portfolio had grown as much as Henrik's records suggested, there was a real possibility that the trust fund money had moved more than once before anyone outside the family noticed. And judging by the look that passed briefly between my parents after signing the agreement, they knew exactly how many other places it had gone. Part 14. The sound of the pen scratching across paper lingered in the room long after the signatures were finished. 2 names, 2 lines of ink. And with that, the agreement was no longer a discussion. It was a document. I carefully pulled the page toward me and let it rest beside the hospital ledger. The candles on the anniversary cake were nearly burned down to their bases now, their flames smaller and uneven. Wax had pooled into soft white puddles across the frosting. For a dinner that had been planned as a celebration of 35 years of marriage, the cake had become a quiet spectator to something else entirely. No one reached for it. Daniel was the first to break the silence. Well, he said quietly, that settles the hospital story. His tone wasn't mocking. If anything, it sounded relieved. A clear conclusion had finally been reached after nearly an hour of slow unraveling. My father leaned back again, folding his hands together. The decision to sign had clearly cost him something, but it had also given him a new position to stand on. The agreement addressed the matter Patrick raised, he said evenly, which means this discussion should now be finished. The way he said finished was deliberate. A boundary. A signal that the rest of the family should accept the resolution and move on. Several relatives nodded instinctively. People are often grateful for the moment when tension in a room receives official permission to end. But Sophia wasn't one of them. She studied the trust fund ledger again, then the signed agreement, then Emily. Her expression carried the quiet focus of someone who had noticed one piece of the puzzle still sitting slightly out of place. The agreement clarified the hospital payments, she said thoughtfully, but the trust fund itself still hasn't really been explained. My father's eyes flickered toward her. The investment account used those funds years ago, he replied calmly. Emily's graduate program only used part of the investment return. Sophia nodded. Yes, but that still leaves the original amount. She tapped the ledger lightly. Because if the trust fund was invested successfully, and only part of the profits later funded Emily's education, then the original capital plus the remaining investment growth must still exist somewhere. The room went quiet again, because the logic was clean. Investment growth had been confirmed by Henrik's earlier comment. Emily's program had only used a portion of that growth, which meant the original trust fund value and most of the profits it generated had never been accounted for in the conversation. Eric leaned forward slowly. He looked at my father. Where is the rest of it? My mother spoke before he could answer. The funds became part of the broader Walsh family holdings portfolio, she said smoothly, which meant they contributed to long-term family financial stability. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but Daniel frowned slightly. He glanced toward the agreement again, then back at my parents. Patrick never benefited from that stability, he said. My father's patience thinned again. Patrick has built a very successful career, he said firmly. His financial position hardly suggests he was harmed. There it was, a subtle shift in argument, from whether the money had been taken to whether I had suffered because of it, a common tactic in financial disputes. If the person ultimately succeeded anyway, the original transaction suddenly appears less serious. Sophia noticed it immediately. She tilted her head slightly. Success later doesn't change ownership earlier, she said quietly. Henrik nodded once, almost imperceptibly. My father saw that gesture, and for the first time that evening he looked genuinely tired, because he understood something now that had probably been obvious to the rest of the room for a while. Signing the agreement had ended the hospital narrative, but it hadn't erased the trust fund. And once people start examining a financial story closely, they rarely stop at the first answer. Emily looked at me cautiously. Patrick, she asked softly, what happens now? It was the same question my father had asked earlier, but Emily's version carried a very different tone. Not defensive, not strategic, just uncertain. I looked down at the signed agreement, then at the trust fund ledger, then around the table at the relatives who had watched the entire evening unfold piece by piece. Nothing dramatic happens now, I said. The hospital story is corrected. The agreement goes into my firm's records, and the rest of the evening continues however the family wants it to. Eric raised an eyebrow. That's it? I nodded. That's it? The simplicity of the answer surprised several people, because after everything that had surfaced tonight, most of them expected some larger confrontation, a demand, a repayment request, something. But the agreement had never been about reclaiming the trust fund, at least not directly. Daniel studied me carefully. You're not asking for the money back. It wasn't really a question, just an observation. I shook my head. The account had been moved years ago. Untangling that now would be complicated, legally messy, and emotionally exhausting. Across the table, my father watched me very carefully, because he understood the deeper meaning of that decision. If I had demanded repayment tonight, the conversation would have turned into a legal battle. By not demanding it, I had done something far more dangerous. I had allowed the entire family to see the story clearly without appearing vindictive. Reputation damage without financial aggression. A forensic accountant's version of restraint. My mother recognized it too. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied me. You've always been very precise with your choices, she said quietly. The compliment sounded genuine, but there was something almost wary in her voice now, because she understood something important. I hadn't come to reclaim money. I had come to reclaim the narrative, and now the entire room knew the difference. Daniel finally stood up slowly and walked over to the cake. The candles were barely holding their flames now. "We should probably cut this before the restaurant thinks we've forgotten it," he said lightly. A few relatives laughed softly. The tension loosened just enough for people to breathe again. Plates shifted. Chairs moved. The staff quickly stepped forward to help prepare the dessert service. For the first time in nearly an hour, the room began to look like a dinner party again. But as Daniel lifted the knife to cut the cake, Henrik Madsen quietly said something that made the room pause one more time. He had been reviewing the forensic summary again, and there was one small note near the bottom he had just noticed. A line referencing something called the College Fund Ledger Audit Trail. Henrik looked toward me calmly. "Patrick," he said, "I'm curious about one thing. You mentioned earlier that the trust fund withdrawal records came from the bank archive, but the audit trail reference suggests there was a second ledger connected to that account." The room went silent again, because everyone knew what an audit trail meant. A record of where money moved after the first transfer. Daniel slowly lowered the cake knife. Emily looked at me nervously, and my father's shoulders stiffened, because if a second ledger existed, then tonight's story might not be finished yet. Part 15. Henrik Madsen had asked the question calmly. Too calmly. That was the unsettling part. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything. His tone held the quiet curiosity of a man who had spent decades reading financial records and knew that sometimes the smallest footnote in a ledger explained the entire story. But the phrase audit trail had landed like a stone in still water. Daniel's hand remained frozen in the air, the cake knife hovering just above the frosting. The restaurant staff waiting beside the table hesitated politely, unsure whether to continue serving dessert or retreat back toward the kitchen. No one spoke, because everyone at the table had seen my father's reaction. It was subtle, just a tightening of his shoulders, a stiffness that hadn't appeared during the hospital ledger reveal, or the trust fund conversation, or even Emily's unexpected admission about her graduate program. But the moment Henrik mentioned a second ledger, my father had stopped breathing for half a second, and everyone noticed. Emily's eyes moved slowly between my father and me. She knew what an audit trail meant, not just a transaction, a path. Money rarely disappears cleanly in financial systems. It moves through accounts, through subsidiaries, through holding structures. Each step leaves a signature. Henrik folded the forensic summary gently and placed it back on the table. "You may have already reviewed it, of course," he said politely, "but the notation suggests the original trust withdrawal triggered a secondary record at the holding company level." Daniel lowered the cake knife onto the table. The dessert could wait, because if a second ledger existed, then the evening might not be finished at all. My mother watched me carefully. "Patrick," she said softly, "you've already made your point tonight. The hospital narrative has been corrected." Her voice carried a subtle message. Let the rest stay buried. But I had spent years learning something about financial documents. They don't bury themselves. They wait, quietly, until someone asks the right question. Henrik had asked it, and now the room was looking at me. I opened the slim leather folder again. Inside it were the documents most people had already seen tonight. Hospital payment records, the trust fund withdrawal ledger, the forensic summary. But beneath those pages, there was one more sheet, a photocopy of a bank archive record. Not dramatic, just a transaction routing document, the kind that only becomes interesting when someone follows it. Daniel noticed the extra page first. He leaned closer. "You do have the audit trail." My father spoke sharply before I could answer. "Patrick has already presented more than enough paperwork tonight." The firmness in his voice surprised several relatives. because until now he had tried to appear calm, almost cooperative. Now something closer to urgency had crept in, but Daniel's curiosity had already been activated. If the ledger shows where the money went after the holding company account, he said slowly, that would explain a lot. Emily's voice was barely audible. Patrick, did you know? I looked at her. Yes, her face paled slightly, because she understood the implication immediately. Whatever the second ledger showed, it wasn't just about Emily's tuition anymore. My mother leaned forward. Her composure remained intact, but there was steel beneath it now. Patrick, she said carefully, financial structures inside family companies can be complex. Documents without context often lead to misunderstandings. The warning was gentle, but unmistakable. Several relatives glanced between us nervously. Family investments, holding companies, trust funds. These topics were starting to feel less like dinner conversation and more like the beginning of something much larger. Henrik remained silent, but his attention hadn't moved away from the folder, because professionals recognize that moment when someone is deciding whether to reveal the final page of a story. Daniel spoke again. Patrick, he said quietly, did the money move again after the holding company account? I slid the photocopy out of the folder and placed it on the table. The paper itself looked ordinary, a simple bank routing statement, date, account numbers, transfer amount. But the destination account name sat clearly in the middle of the page. Walsh Strategic Ventures. Sophia frowned. Isn't that your father's private investment arm? Eric nodded slowly. Yes, separate from Walsh Family Holdings. Daniel looked at the transfer amount. His eyebrows lifted. Wait a second. He compared the number with the trust fund withdrawal figure printed on the earlier ledger. They matched almost exactly. The room went silent, because suddenly the entire financial path had become visible. Trust fund withdrawal, transfer to Walsh Family Holdings, secondary transfer to Walsh Strategic Ventures. The money had not simply strengthened the family portfolio. It had moved into my father's personal venture investment structure. When Emily stared at the document as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if she looked long enough. But they didn't. Henrik leaned slightly forward. That structure would give the account holder direct control over the capital allocation, he observed calmly, which meant something very specific. The money originally placed in a trust for my education had eventually ended up under my father's personal investment authority. My father finally stood, not abruptly, just firmly. This conversation has gone far beyond the purpose of this evening, he said. But Daniel didn't look intimidated. He pointed at the transfer record. Patrick's college fund became your venture capital seed money. My father's jaw tightened. Business decisions require flexibility. Eric shook his head slowly. That's not flexibility. That's repurposing someone else's fund. Emily covered her mouth, because the realization had finally landed fully. Her graduate program hadn't simply been supported by family profits. Part of that support had come from investment gains built on Patrick's original trust capital, and the rest had helped launch their father's personal venture portfolio. My mother stood now too. Her voice was calm, but the control behind it had hardened again. Patrick, she said, if you intend to suggest wrongdoing, then this discussion needs to move out of a restaurant and into proper legal channels. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably, because now the evening had crossed into dangerous territory, legal territory. But I shook my head. I'm not suggesting anything tonight. I tapped the document gently. I'm just showing where the money went. Daniel looked at the transfer date again, then slowly exhaled, because he had just noticed something else printed near the bottom of the routing record. A small notation indicating the investment classification used when the capital entered Walsh Strategic Ventures. He read it aloud quietly. Founding partner, capital contribution. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict, because everyone at the table understood what it meant. The trust fund originally created for my future had been recorded as the founding capital that helped establish my father's private investment firm. And suddenly the entire room realized something else at the same time. If that firm had grown successfully over the years, then Patrick's college fund might not just be missing. It might have quietly multiplied into something far larger than anyone at the table had imagined. Part 16. For a long moment after Daniel read the notation aloud, no one moved. The phrase "founding partner capital contribution" sat in the middle of the page like a quiet headline. It didn't sound dramatic. In fact, it sounded almost respectable, the kind of wording you might see in a financial magazine article about a promising investment firm taking its first steps. But everyone at the table understood what it meant. The capital used to launch Walsh Strategic Ventures had not come from nowhere. It had come from the trust fund originally established for my education. And that small difference in wording changed the entire shape of the story. My father remained standing. The calm he had carried for most of the evening was beginning to fracture now, though he still kept his voice controlled. "You're presenting an extremely simplified interpretation of a complex investment structure," he said. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He simply looked down at the number printed on the transfer record again. Then he looked at Henrik. If the capital entered the venture firm under that classification, that would make it the founding equity stake, right? Henrik didn't rush his answer. He adjusted his glasses and studied the document carefully, as though giving my father every possible chance for the interpretation to be wrong. But the wording was precise. "Yes," he said quietly. "That would normally indicate the original equity contribution made by the founding partner." The room absorbed that explanation in silence, because Walsh Strategic Ventures was not a small side account. Several relatives at the table had read about it over the years in business publications. The firm had backed technology startups, renewable energy projects, and several Nordic logistics companies that had grown rapidly. It had become one of my father's proudest achievements, a symbol of his business instincts, a story he told often at family gatherings, but no one at those gatherings had ever asked where the first capital came from. Until now. Emily's voice came out thin. "How much is the firm worth now?" The question sounded almost afraid of its own answer. My father looked at her sharply. "That information is not relevant to this conversation." But Daniel had already taken out his phone. Public filings would give a rough estimate. He searched quietly for several seconds. Then his eyebrows lifted. Oh, that single syllable made half the table lean closer. Daniel turned the screen so Sophia could see. She inhaled slowly. Walsh Strategic Ventures had grown far beyond its initial seed investment. Several successful exits, equity stakes in companies that had scaled internationally, estimated portfolio valuation in the high 8 figures, possibly more depending on private holdings. Eric leaned back slowly in his chair. "You're telling me Patrick's college fund helped launch an investment firm worth that?" No one answered immediately, because even without exact numbers, the scale had become obvious. The original trust account might have contained a modest education fund, but once that money entered venture capital markets, it had multiplied. Emily looked at me again. "Patrick, did you know how large it became?" I nodded slightly. Not the exact valuation, but enough. Her shoulders sank back into her chair, because she understood what that meant. The story tonight had started with hospital receipts. Then, it had exposed a missing college fund. Now it had uncovered the foundation of a major investment firm, and the entire path had been sitting quietly inside financial records for years. My mother's voice cut through the silence. "Patrick," she said firmly, "if you're implying that your father owes you a share of his firm, then this discussion absolutely needs legal representation." Several relatives shifted uncomfortably again, because now the evening was touching territory that could fracture families permanently. But I shook my head again. "I'm not asking for a share of the firm." Daniel looked surprised. "You're not?" Sophia looked equally confused. "Then why bring the audit trail tonight?" My father's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, Patrick. Why? I rested my hands lightly on the table, because tonight wasn't about ownership claims. It was about something else. For years, the family narrative had been very simple. Patrick struggled. Patrick needed help. Patrick's parents paid the hospital bills. Patrick's parents supported the family through their success. That version of events had repeated itself at holidays, dinners, speeches, and quiet conversations for more than a decade. But the documents told a different story, one where the financial current had flowed the other direction. My trust fund became venture capital. My father's venture capital became a successful firm. Meanwhile, I paid my own education, my own medical expenses, and built my own career. Daniel finally understood. You're not here for money. I shook my head. No, I'm here for accuracy. Emily wiped a tear quickly from the corner of her eye, because accuracy can be heavier than accusation. Accusations create fights. Accuracy creates silence. My father looked at me for a long time, then he asked the question that had been building all evening. What do you intend to do with this information? The room waited for my answer, because everyone assumed the next step would be obvious. Legal claims, financial negotiations, something dramatic, but my response surprised them. Nothing. Daniel blinked. Nothing? The agreement correcting the hospital narrative was already signed. The trust fund documents were already public inside the family, and the audit trail had simply clarified where the money ultimately went. That was enough. I gathered the papers back into the leather folder. My mother studied me carefully. You expect us to believe that you went through all this effort simply to correct a story at dinner? Not simply, but mostly, because stories shape reputations, and reputations shape how families treat people. For years, I had been the child who needed rescuing, the child who had been carried by his parents' generosity. Now everyone at the table knew something different. Henrik spoke quietly. In finance, transparency often resolves conflicts more effectively than litigation. I nodded. Exactly. My father slowly sat back down. For the first time that evening, he looked older. Not defeated exactly, but aware that something permanent had shifted. The narrative he had relied on for years had quietly collapsed under documentation. Emily looked around the table. So, what happens now? Daniel finally picked up the cake knife again. Now, he said slowly, we cut the anniversary cake, because after everything that had surfaced tonight, the most uncomfortable truth might be this. The financial battle everyone expected was never the real goal. The real goal had been making sure the entire room learned who had actually built their lives without the help they claimed. And that realization was far harder to undo than any lawsuit. Part 17, Daniel cut the cake carefully, as if he were handling fragile glass instead of frosting and sponge. The knife slid through the layers with a soft sound, dividing what had been meant as a symbol of celebration into neat triangular pieces. The restaurant staff moved again, relieved to see some version of normal dinner activity return to the table. Plates appeared, forks followed. The candles, now nearly extinguished, were gently removed. Yet, the atmosphere around the table remained very different from when the evening began. People spoke again, but quietly. Conversations moved in small, cautious circles, never straying far from the documents that had dominated the last hour. Emily accepted a slice of cake, but barely touched it. Daniel leaned back in his chair, still thinking. Sophia was reviewing the trust ledger again, though now it felt less like evidence and more like a historical artifact, proof of a story the room would never forget. Across from me, my father sat very still. My mother had resumed her composed posture, but her attention moved constantly between the relatives, measuring the mood, assessing the damage, because that was the real change tonight. Nothing had exploded. No legal accusations had been made. But the narrative inside the family had shifted permanently. And stories, once corrected publicly, rarely returned to their previous form. Eric broke the quiet first. Patrick, he said slowly, I have to admit something. I nodded. For years I thought you stayed quiet because you didn't want to challenge your parents. He gestured lightly toward the folder beside my plate. Turns out you were just waiting for the right moment. I smiled faintly. Accountants tend to value timing. Daniel laughed softly. That might be the most understated revenge story I've ever seen. My mother's eyes flickered toward him. Revenge is an interesting word to use, she said calmly. Daniel didn't back down. Not revenge in the dramatic sense, but Patrick did dismantle a long-running story tonight without raising his voice once. That takes planning. Emily finally spoke again. Patrick always planned things carefully. There was admiration in her voice now, but also regret, because she understood something that many families struggle to recognize until it's too late. Quiet people remember everything. My father finally picked up his fork. The cake sat untouched on his plate for a long moment before he spoke. Patrick, he said, you've corrected the hospital story. You've revealed the trust fund history. You've explained the investment trail. His gaze lifted to meet mine. But you still haven't told us why tonight. Not the general reason. The specific one. The question hung over the table. Because he was right. Documents can be revealed at any time. Yet I had chosen this evening, their anniversary dinner, in front of the extended family. That decision had not been accidental. I considered my answer carefully. Then I said the truth, because this was the first time the entire family was in the same room after the firm completed its last major investment exit. Daniel looked up immediately. Right. The logistics company sale last month. That deal had been in several business publications. A major exit. Large valuation. My father understood the implication instantly. His eyes narrowed slightly. You timed this with the exit announcement, I nodded. Because once that deal closed, the founding capital of Walsh Strategic Ventures had officially multiplied several times over, which meant the trust fund money that started the firm had now completed its full investment cycle. Henrik looked intrigued. From a financial perspective, that would make tonight the first moment when the entire growth arc could be documented clearly. Exactly. Emily looked between us nervously. So Patrick waited until the investment cycle was finished before saying anything. Daniel leaned back again. That's actually brilliant. My mother studied me in silence because she understood something deeper behind the explanation. You didn't want the story corrected until the firm had already succeeded, she said quietly. I nodded again. If I had revealed the audit trail earlier, the family narrative might have changed, but the firm's success could still have been uncertain. But now the entire arc was visible. Trust fund, investment seed, firm growth, major exit, a complete financial timeline, which meant the story could no longer be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a failed gamble. Sophia tilted her head thoughtfully. So tonight the family learns the truth at the same time the market confirms the success. Daniel pointed his fork toward me. You basically waited until the numbers spoke for themselves. Yes. My father looked down at his plate. For the first time that evening, something like reluctant respect appeared in his expression. You really are an accountant, he said quietly. The comment sounded almost like a compliment. Emily finally tasted a small bite of cake. Then she asked something that surprised everyone. Patrick, are you angry? The question caught the table off guard. Because anger had never actually appeared during the evening. Just facts, documents, corrections. I thought about it honestly before answering. I used to be. Years ago. When I first discovered the trust fund had disappeared, when I realized the hospital story was being told incorrectly. But anger fades when you spend enough time building your own life. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense. Sophia added quietly, and tonight wasn't about anger anyway. It was about closing the record. Exactly. Emily exhaled in relief, because the tone of the evening had just shifted again. Not toward conflict, but toward something more final. My mother leaned back slightly. Patrick, she said, you've clearly spent years preparing for this moment. The statement wasn't accusatory, just observational. And in that moment, I realized something interesting. She still believed the evening had been about the past. But she was wrong. Because the documents in the folder weren't the only reason I had come tonight. There was one more item inside, one more paper no one at the table had seen yet, and it had nothing to do with trust funds, hospital bills, or venture capital. It had to do with something much simpler, a set of signatures. Signatures that would quietly close the final chapter of the story. And when the family saw that document, they would finally understand that tonight had never been about proving what happened years ago. It had been about making sure the future looked very different. Part 18. The cake disappeared slowly, not because anyone was particularly hungry, but because eating gave people something ordinary to do while their minds caught up with everything that had just happened. Forks tapped plates, water glasses were refilled. The restaurant's soft lighting and distant conversations from other tables created the strange illusion that this dinner was normal. But at our table, everyone was still recalculating the past. Emily had finally finished half of her slice. Daniel was leaning back with his arms folded, replaying the financial timeline in his head. Sophia occasionally glanced toward the leather folder beside me, not because she was suspicious anymore, but because she had sensed something earlier. A hesitation, a moment when I had almost mentioned something else. Across from me, my mother had returned to her familiar composure. Her posture was perfect again, her voice calm. But she was studying me carefully, the way someone studies a chess opponent who has just revealed a long strategy, because she understood that people rarely spend years preparing documentation simply to end with a polite dinner. "Patrick," she said at last, "you mentioned signatures earlier." Several relatives looked up. Daniel's curiosity returned instantly. "Signatures for what?" My father's gaze sharpened, because he had heard that word too. And he knew enough about business to understand that signatures usually mean contracts. I wiped a small crumb from the edge of my plate before answering. "It's nothing dramatic." The understatement made Daniel laugh softly. "After tonight, that phrase doesn't mean what you think it means anymore." But I continued calmly. "It's simply paperwork related to the Copenhagen apartment." Emily blinked. "Your apartment?" I nodded. "Yes." A small pause followed, because that topic sounded harmless compared to everything else discussed tonight. But Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. "You bought that place years ago, didn't you?" I nodded again. "About 9 years ago." Daniel looked confused. "So what signatures are needed now?" The answer was simple. A release form. My father's expression changed immediately, because he understood the implication before anyone else did. Emily looked between us uncertainly. "Release from what?" I reached into the folder again. Not for another ledger this time, just a single sheet of legal paper, much shorter than the financial documents, much simpler. I placed it gently on the table. The heading read, "Family Financial Guarantee Release." Daniel leaned forward to read. His eyebrows rose slowly. "Wait, your parents guaranteed the mortgage on that apartment?" I nodded. "When I first moved to Copenhagen, I didn't have enough credit history for the bank to approve the full loan independently, so my parents had signed as secondary guarantors." Emily nodded slowly. That made sense. Many young professionals rely on family guarantees when purchasing their first property. But Daniel kept reading. Then he frowned. "The release form confirms the loan balance has been paid in full." My father looked at me. "You refinanced?" "No, I paid it off last month." The room went quiet again, because real estate in Copenhagen is not inexpensive. Emily stared. "You paid the entire mortgage?" "Yes." Sophia looked impressed. "That's a significant milestone." But Daniel was still studying the document. The release removes the guarantors from any remaining financial obligation. He looked up, which means your parents' signatures are required to confirm they no longer hold responsibility for the loan. I nodded. "Exactly." My mother's voice remained smooth. "And you brought this tonight because the bank requires the guarantors to sign the release before the property title updates completely." My father leaned back slowly. "So after tonight, the apartment belongs entirely to you?" "Yes." Emily looked relieved. That's actually wonderful news. But Daniel was watching me more carefully now, because something about the timing still felt deliberate. You waited until tonight to ask for the signatures. I shrugged lightly. It was the first time everyone would already be gathered. The explanation sounded reasonable, but my father's eyes stayed on the document because he understood something deeper. Once the release was signed, there would be no remaining financial connection between us, no guarantees, no shared liabilities, no leverage, complete independence. He looked at me again. You could have mailed this. Technically true, but signing documents in person removes complications. My mother picked up the paper. Her eyes moved carefully over the legal language. Then she asked a question that revealed she understood exactly what was happening. Patrick, once this is signed, there will be no remaining financial ties between you and the family. The room absorbed the sentence slowly, because suddenly the meaning of the document became clearer. The trust fund had already been gone for years. The hospital narrative had been corrected tonight. And the apartment release would remove the last formal connection. Daniel whispered quietly, "This isn't just paperwork." Emily looked at me with sudden concern. "Patrick, are you leaving the family?" I shook my head gently. "No, families don't work like that. You don't resign from them. But financial independence is different. And clarity matters." My father studied me for several seconds, then something unexpected happened. He reached for the pen again, without arguing, without negotiating. He signed the release form. The motion was calm, decisive. Then he slid the pen toward my mother. She hesitated only briefly before adding her signature beneath his. 2 more lines of ink, another quiet ending. Daniel exhaled. That's it then, the last financial tie. I placed the document back in the folder. Yes. Emily looked down at the table. Part of her seemed relieved. Part of her seemed sad, because the evening had quietly redrawn the map of the family. No dramatic explosion, just boundaries, clear ones. My father picked up his fork again and finished the last bite of cake on his plate. Then he looked at me one more time. "Patrick," he said, "you've closed every ledger tonight. The hospital story, the trust fund trail, and now the apartment guarantee." He paused slightly, but there was something in his voice that made the rest of the table look up again, because the tone had changed. Not defensive, not angry, something else. Almost curious. "There's just one thing I still don't understand," he continued. "If tonight wasn't about money and it wasn't about revenge, then why did you make sure every relative in this room witnessed it?" The question settled over the table. And for the first time that evening, I realized everyone else wanted to hear the answer too. Part 19. My father's question settled over the table like the final move in a chess game. Why make sure every relative witnessed it? The restaurant around us continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Soft music drifted through the dining room. Glasses clinked at distant tables. A waiter walked past carrying a tray of desserts for another party celebrating something far simpler than financial history. But at our table, every conversation had stopped. Emily looked at me carefully. Daniel leaned forward again. Sophia rested her chin lightly on her hand, and my mother watched with the calm patience of someone who had spent years managing family narratives, because she understood the power of witnesses. Stories told privately can always be reshaped later. Stories witnessed publicly tend to remain exactly as they happened. I answered honestly, because the story was public. Daniel tilted his head. What do you mean? For years, the hospital story had been told in public settings, holiday dinners, family speeches, conversations with relatives who believed my parents had stepped in during a difficult time. The narrative hadn't lived inside quiet, private conversations. It had lived at tables exactly like this one, which meant correcting it privately would never truly fix it. Emily nodded slowly. That makes sense. If the story spread publicly, the correction needed to happen the same way. My mother listened carefully, and though her expression stayed calm, I could see the calculation returning behind her eyes, because she understood the deeper consequence. Public narratives change social dynamics. The quiet hierarchy that had existed inside the family for years had just shifted. Patrick had been the struggling child, the one whose life required parental support. Now the room knew something very different. Daniel leaned back again, so tonight resets the family history. Not dramatically, just accurately. Sophia added thoughtfully, and accuracy tends to stick longer than storytelling. My father looked at the empty cake plate in front of him, then he said something no one at the table expected. "You handled this very carefully." The admission surprised everyone, especially Emily, because it sounded almost like respect. He continued, "You didn't accuse anyone, you didn't demand money. You simply presented records and allowed people to reach their own conclusions." He looked up at me again. "That's effective." Daniel laughed quietly. "Coming from you, that's a serious compliment." My father ignored the comment. Instead, he reached for his water glass and took a slow drink. Then he said something that shifted the atmosphere again. "Patrick, I want to ask you one final question." The phrasing made several relatives glance at each other. Because people often say final question right before something important. I nodded. "Go ahead." He studied me carefully. "Did you ever consider telling us sooner?" The question carried an unusual tone, not defensive, almost reflective. Emily looked at me with the same curiosity. Sophia too, because the truth was obvious. If I had revealed the trust fund audit trail years earlier, the entire financial story might have been exposed long ago. I answered simply, "Yes." Daniel blinked. "Then why didn't you?" "Because earlier the story wouldn't have been complete." Henrik nodded quietly. Incomplete financial narratives are often dismissed. Exactly. Years ago, the firm hadn't yet completed its major investment cycle. The venture portfolio hadn't reached the scale it holds now. If I had revealed the audit trail, then the conversation might have sounded like speculation or resentment. Now the numbers spoke for themselves. My mother leaned back slowly. "You waited until the facts became undeniable." I nodded. "Yes." Daniel shook his head in quiet admiration. "That's patience on another level." Emily smiled faintly. "Patrick always was patient." My father finished his water and set the glass down carefully. Then he said something else unexpected. "You know, there's one advantage to timing things this way." Several relatives leaned forward slightly, because now even he sounded curious about where the conversation might go next. "What advantage?" My father gestured lightly toward the folder. "The documents didn't just explain the past, they also closed the argument." He looked around the table. "Everyone here now understands the financial history, which means there's no point debating it later." Daniel nodded slowly. "True, no rumors left to correct. No competing stories, just the record." My father looked back at me again, "And that means something interesting happens next." Emily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He gave a small shrug. "The family moves forward, not backward." The statement surprised several people, because for most of the evening, everyone assumed the conversation would end with tension, or distance, or resentment. But my father sounded almost relieved. My mother noticed the shift too. Her eyes moved between us. "Patrick," she said quietly, "if tonight truly closes the past, then I suppose we should consider what happens going forward." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerously close to progress." Emily laughed softly, the first genuine laugh of the evening. But I didn't answer immediately, because there was one more truth that hadn't been said yet. Not about money. Not about trust funds. Something simpler. Something the evening had quietly revealed without anyone pointing at it directly. My father noticed the pause. "Patrick?" I looked around the table. At Emily, at Daniel, at the relatives who had watched the entire story unfold piece by piece. Then I said something that made several people sit up straighter in their chairs. Tonight didn't just correct the past. It also revealed something important about the future. Emily blinked. "What?" I closed the folder gently. For the first time in years, this family actually heard the same story at the same time. And that meant something had finally happened that had never happened before. No one in the room could pretend they didn't know the truth anymore. Part 20. The realization settled slowly around the table. No one could pretend they didn't know the truth anymore. It was such a simple sentence, but the weight behind it was enormous. For years, our family had operated inside layers of slightly different versions of the same story. Small adjustments, convenient omissions, gentle exaggerations told often enough that they eventually sounded like facts. Some relatives believed one version, others believed another. But tonight had done something unusual. It had synchronized the narrative. Daniel leaned back in his chair and let out a quiet breath. That's actually rare in families, Sophia nodded. Usually everyone leaves a conflict like this with different interpretations. Emily looked around the table thoughtfully, but not tonight. No. Tonight everyone had watched the same documents appear in the same order. Hospital receipts, trust fund ledger, investment transfer, audit trail, and finally the apartment release. There were no side conversations or secondhand explanations involved, just records. My mother studied me carefully, and I could see the moment she understood the deeper implication of what I had just said. If everyone now knew the same story, then the old narrative could never quietly return. Patrick, she said slowly, you're saying the real outcome tonight isn't financial. I nodded. Exactly. Daniel smiled. It's reputational. The word landed softly, but it explained everything. Reputation inside families works differently than reputation in public life. There are no press releases, no official corrections, just stories people repeat over years. Tonight that repetition had been interrupted. My father rested his elbows lightly on the table. He looked thoughtful rather than defensive now, which was new. Reputations are difficult to rebuild once they shift, he said. True, but I wasn't trying to rebuild anything, just correct the record. Emily tilted her head slightly. And now that the record is corrected, what happens between you and Mom and Dad? The question felt more personal than anything that had come before. Daniel looked at me curiously. Sophia did too. Even my parents seemed interested in the answer, because until now, the evening had focused on documents, not relationships. I considered the question honestly. Then I gave the only answer that made sense. Nothing dramatic changes. Emily frowned slightly. Really? I nodded. Families don't reset overnight. People still carry their habits, their expectations, their personalities, but something important has changed. My father waited. What? Clarity. The word hung in the air for a moment, because quieter than forgiveness, quieter than reconciliation, but often more durable. Daniel nodded slowly. Clarity means nobody wastes energy arguing about what actually happened. Exactly, Sophia added thoughtfully. And it also means future conversations start from the same facts. Emily exhaled slowly. I like that. My mother folded her hands together again. Her expression had softened slightly, though the sharp intelligence behind it was still present. Patrick, she said, you've always been very precise, but tonight was more than precise. It was strategic. The observation wasn't critical, just accurate. Daniel laughed again. Strategic might be an understatement. Emily smiled faintly. Patrick always thought 10 moves ahead. My father looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone. You know what the most interesting part of tonight is? Daniel raised an eyebrow. I'm almost afraid to ask. My father gestured lightly toward the empty plates and folded documents. Despite everything revealed tonight, Patrick never once asked for anything. Emily nodded slowly. He didn't. No demand for repayment. No legal threat. No attempt to claim a share of the investment firm. Just corrections. Sophia looked thoughtful, which actually makes the whole evening more powerful. Daniel agreed. If Patrick had demanded money, half the room would assume it was about profit. But without that, the focus stays on the facts. My mother glanced at the leather folder again. You must have considered what you could legally pursue. I didn't deny it. Of course, any accountant would. Emily looked surprised. You mean you actually calculated it? Daniel laughed. Of course he did. My father looked genuinely curious now. And I shrugged lightly. It would have been complicated. The investments were made years ago. The capital was mixed with other funds. Tracing proportional ownership through multiple venture rounds would require lengthy legal work. Sophia nodded. That's true. Venture structures can become extremely complex over time. Emily looked relieved. So walking away was easier. I shook my head slightly. Not easier. Just cleaner. Daniel pointed toward me with his fork. That might be the most accountant answer I've ever heard. My father studied me again. Then he said quietly, "You could still pursue it later." The room became still again, because that sentence introduced a possibility no one had spoken about yet. The legal option still existed, even after tonight. Emily looked at me nervously. "Patrick, would you?" I met my father's gaze calmly. "No." The answer came quickly. "Certain." Daniel blinked. "You're sure?" "Yes, because that wasn't the purpose of tonight." My mother tilted her head slightly. "Then what was?" I leaned back in my chair. The restaurant had grown quieter as the evening moved later. Several nearby tables were already empty. The staff was beginning to reset part of the dining room. And in that calm moment, I explained the simplest truth of the entire night. For years, I was the child who needed help, the one who was supposedly carried by the family's success. Tonight, the entire room learned something different. Daniel nodded slowly. Patrick carried himself. Emily looked proud. Sophia smiled faintly. My father didn't speak, but the expression on his face had changed. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. Because he understood what had actually happened tonight. The family hierarchy had quietly rearranged itself, and no amount of future storytelling could undo that shift. Emily glanced at the clock on the wall. It was getting late. The anniversary dinner had lasted far longer than anyone expected. But before the evening ended completely, Daniel asked one final question. "Patrick, do you think this changes how the family sees you?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered honestly, it already has, because earlier tonight everyone assumed I came here hoping to repair something. But the truth was the opposite. I had come here to close something. And now that it was closed, the next chapter of my life would look very different from the one they had always imagined. Part 21. The words lingered in the quiet restaurant. The next chapter of my life would look very different from the one they had always imagined. No one immediately asked what that meant, but the question was sitting on every face at the table. Emily noticed it first. "Patrick, different how?" Daniel leaned forward slightly. Because after everything revealed tonight, the idea that there was still another development left felt almost unbelievable. My mother watched me closely again. Her instincts had always been sharp when it came to sensing a shift in direction. "Patrick," she said calmly, "you didn't bring those documents tonight just to end the past. You also brought them to clear the ground for something new." The observation was accurate, and several relatives realized it at the same moment. Daniel snapped his fingers lightly. "Of course." He looked at me with a grin. "You're about to tell us something." Sophia nodded slowly. The timing of tonight wasn't just about the investment exit. It was also about whatever comes next. My father rested his hands on the table again. His expression was thoughtful now, rather than guarded. "Very well, Patrick," he said. "Let's hear it." Emily looked both excited and nervous, because the atmosphere at the table had changed again. Earlier, everyone had been bracing for conflict. Now they were waiting for news. I glanced around the room once more. The restaurant staff were quietly clearing nearby tables. Outside the tall windows, the Copenhagen streetlights reflected off the canal water in long yellow lines. This city had been my home for years, but it was about to become something else. I reached into the folder again. Not for a ledger, not for a legal document, just a printed letter. Daniel laughed softly. There really was one more paper. I placed it on the table. Emily leaned forward to read first. Her eyes moved quickly across the page, then widened. "Patrick." Daniel leaned over her shoulder. His reaction came a second later. "No way." Sophia leaned in next. Henrik adjusted his glasses and read the heading carefully. My father didn't move yet. My mother did. Her expression shifted almost immediately, because the letterhead was unmistakable. Nordic Global Finance Group, one of the largest financial advisory networks in Northern Europe. Emily finally looked up. Patrick, this is an appointment letter. Yes, Daniel whistled quietly. Managing Partner, International Forensic Advisory Division. Sophia looked impressed. That's enormous. Emily's voice trembled slightly with excitement. This means you're running the entire division? Across multiple countries. Yes, the promotion had been finalized 2 weeks earlier, but I hadn't told anyone in the family yet. My father finally reached forward and read the letter himself. His eyes moved slowly across the page. When he reached the final paragraph, he leaned back. Then he asked the question everyone was thinking. Where will you be based? I answered simply, London. Emily blinked. You're moving? Yes. The role requires relocation. Daniel leaned back and shook his head with a smile. You dismantle the family financial mythology and announce an international promotion in the same night. That's impressive timing. Sophia nodded. It also explains the apartment payoff. Exactly. Selling the property would have been complicated with a mortgage and guarantors still attached. The release document solved that. Emily looked between me and the letter again. When do you leave? 3 months. My mother spoke quietly. You planned this entire evening around your departure. I nodded. Partly, because once the move happened, family gatherings would become less frequent. Correcting the record before leaving felt responsible. Daniel laughed softly again. Only Patrick would describe this evening as responsible. My father set the letter down carefully. London is a significant step. Yes, Nordic Global Finance Group had been expanding its forensic advisory division rapidly. Complex international financial investigations, corporate accountability work, cross-border audits. The role would place me at the center of projects involving banks, multinational companies, and government regulators. Henrik looked genuinely impressed now. That position carries enormous professional influence. Daniel added with a grin, and probably a salary that makes the hospital bills look like pocket change. Emily nudged him. Daniel, but he shrugged. Just saying. My mother remained quiet for several seconds. Then she asked something that surprised me. Are you happy about it? The question sounded sincere, not strategic, honestly. Yes, very. Because the promotion wasn't just professional progress. It was the final confirmation that the life I had built independently was strong enough to stand anywhere. My father folded his hands together again. London is far from Copenhagen. Not that far, but far enough that family dynamics shift naturally. Emily looked slightly sad now. I'm going to miss having you nearby. Daniel smiled at her. London flights are 2 hours. We'll visit, Sophia added. And I suspect Patrick will still return for holidays occasionally. I nodded. Of course. Leaving the city didn't mean leaving the family entirely, but the balance would be different. My father looked at the letter again, then at me, and he said something that felt unexpectedly sincere. You've built something impressive. The compliment came quietly, but everyone at the table heard it. Emily smiled warmly. About time you said that. My mother nodded slightly. Yes. Patrick has clearly done well for himself, Daniel grinned. Understatement of the year. The restaurant staff approached to clear the final plates. The dinner had finally reached its natural end. But before anyone stood up to leave, my father said one more thing. Patrick, I looked at him. When you first walked in tonight, I thought you were coming to reopen old wounds. He paused briefly. Now I see you came to close them. The acknowledgement hung quietly between us. And for the first time in many years, the distance between us felt less like conflict and more like understanding. Part 22. The restaurant was nearly empty by the time we stood up from the table. The long dinner that had begun with polite smiles and anniversary congratulations had stretched far into the evening. The staff moved quietly around us now, clearing the last of the dishes and resetting tables for the following day. Outside the tall windows, Copenhagen had settled into its late-night calm. The canal water reflected streetlights in soft golden lines, and the occasional bicycle passed along the quiet street. For a moment, no one rushed to leave. Emily gathered her coat slowly. Daniel folded his napkin and placed it beside his empty plate. Sophia stood near the back of her chair, still processing the evening in the thoughtful way she approached most things. And my parents remained seated for a few seconds longer, as if acknowledging that the night had become something larger than an anniversary dinner. My father finally stood. 35 years of marriage, he said with a faint smile toward my mother. Not the quiet celebration we planned. Daniel chuckled. Memorable, though, Emily added softly. Very memorable. The restaurant manager approached politely to thank them for celebrating their anniversary there. My mother handled the exchange gracefully, as she always did, offering a warm smile and kind words that made the moment feel almost ordinary again. But as we began moving toward the entrance, Daniel stepped beside me. You realize tonight will be talked about in this family for years. I smiled slightly. Probably. He shook his head with amused disbelief. You corrected a decade of storytelling, revealed a venture capital origin story, and announced a major international promotion, all during dessert. That's efficient. Emily overheard and laughed quietly. Patrick has always been efficient. Sophia joined us near the door. What surprises me most is that nothing exploded. She looked back toward my parents briefly. Many families would have turned tonight into a full argument, but instead, she gestured toward the folder still tucked under my arm. Documents did the talking. Exactly. Because when facts arrive calmly, people tend to listen differently. Outside the restaurant, the cool evening air felt refreshing after the long dinner. The group gathered briefly on the sidewalk. Taxis passed occasionally, their headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Emily hugged me first. I'm really proud of you, she said quietly. Not just for the promotion, for tonight. I hugged her back. You helped more than you think. She knew what I meant. Her honesty about the graduate program transfer had changed the direction of the conversation earlier. Daniel shook my hand with a grin. If forensic accounting ever becomes a spectator sport, you'll be a legend. Sophia rolled her eyes playfully. Ignore him. But she added more seriously. You handled something very complicated with a lot of restraint. That's rare. Henrik, who had stepped outside behind us, nodded in agreement. Financial truth presented without hostility is surprisingly powerful. Then he smiled faintly. Your new role in London suits that skill. My parents emerged from the restaurant a moment later. For a brief second, the entire family stood together under the soft streetlight. The air carried the quiet feeling of something ending, or perhaps something resetting. My mother adjusted her coat. Patrick, she said, London is a very large stage. Yes, you'll have influence there. That's the idea. She nodded thoughtfully. Just remember something. Reputation matters in every city. I smiled slightly. I know. My father stepped closer then. The earlier tension between us had faded into something calmer. Patrick, he said, I want to say something before we leave tonight. Emily and Daniel both grew quiet because his tone sounded unusually direct. You've proven something this evening. He paused briefly. Not just that the financial records told a different story, but that you built your own success without relying on the family narrative. The acknowledgement was simple, but it carried weight, because my father had rarely admitted things like that openly. I nodded. Thank you. He continued, I suspect London will suit you very well. Coming from him, that sentence felt almost like a blessing. Emily smiled warmly. Daniel checked the time on his phone. Well, before this turns into a full emotional moment, he gestured toward the street. Taxis are disappearing fast. Everyone laughed softly. The group began to separate. Henrik headed toward the metro station. Sophia and Daniel called a ride. Emily waited for a taxi while texting someone on her phone. My parents stood beside me for a moment longer. The streetlight cast long shadows behind us. Patrick, my mother said quietly, Tonight you changed how this family sees you. I shrugged lightly. Maybe, she shook her head gently. No, definitely. There was no criticism in her voice now, just recognition. My father added something else. Sometimes the strongest position in a family is the one that asks for nothing. Daniel, overhearing as he climbed into his car, laughed again. See, even your dad is quoting strategy now. Emily's taxi arrived. She hugged both our parents and then turned back to me. London in 3 months, she said. You better invite me to visit. Of course. Her taxi pulled away down the quiet street. Daniel and Sophia waved from their car as it drove off. Soon it was just the three of us standing there, my parents and me. The canal water moved quietly behind us. My father looked down the street for a moment. Then he said something that felt almost reflective. Families spend years telling stories about each other. Sometimes those stories become habits. My mother nodded, and habits are difficult to change. But tonight had changed one. The story about Patrick. My father looked at me again. You corrected it very thoroughly. I smiled faintly. Accountants tend to prefer accurate records. For a moment, none of us said anything else. Then my parents' car arrived. My mother stepped toward it first. Patrick, she said before getting in. London is not as far away as it seems. I nodded. No, it isn't. My father paused beside the open car door. Then he said one final thing. When the next family gathering happens, I suspect the conversations will sound very different. He wasn't wrong, because the story everyone used to repeat about me had quietly disappeared tonight. And once a family learns the truth together, it becomes very difficult for the old version to ever return. Part 23. The street grew quiet after my parents' car disappeared around the corner. For a few seconds, I remained standing under the streetlight, the leather folder still tucked beneath my arm. The canal water moved slowly beside the sidewalk, reflecting the faint glow of the city. Copenhagen had always been a calm place to live. Predictable, measured. A city where people valued quiet professionalism more than dramatic displays. Maybe that was why the evening had unfolded the way it had. No shouting, no accusations, just documents placed on a table one after another until the story could no longer bend around them. I started walking toward my apartment. The streets were nearly empty now, and the cold air felt clear after the long dinner. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. Emily. Her message was short. Still thinking about tonight. I smiled slightly and replied, Me too. A few seconds later, another message appeared. I'm glad you did it. The honesty in that sentence mattered, because Emily had been part of the same family story for years. Even if she hadn't created it, she had grown up inside it the same way I had. Now she had watched it shift. Another message arrived. London is lucky to get you. I typed back. Copenhagen treated me well first. She sent a small smile emoji and then another message. Dad looked different tonight. I knew exactly what she meant. He had. Not defeated, but thoughtful. The kind of thoughtful that appears when someone realizes the story they believed about a situation wasn't complete. I didn't reply immediately because I wasn't sure how to describe what I had seen in my father's expression either. Eventually I wrote something simple. Maybe everyone did. Emily's response came quickly. True. Another vibration, this time from Daniel. His message was exactly what I expected. You realize you turned an anniversary dinner into the most educational financial seminar our family has ever attended. I laughed quietly to myself. I typed back, You're welcome. Daniel replied almost instantly. Also, if you ever write a book about forensic accounting, I'm buying the first copy. I shook my head with a smile and slipped the phone back into my pocket. By the time I reached my apartment building, the city had grown even quieter. I unlocked the front door and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. Inside, the apartment felt calm and familiar. Bookshelves along the wall, a small desk near the window overlooking the canal, boxes already stacked neatly in one corner, half-packed for the eventual move to London. The apartment had been my anchor in this city, the place where I studied late at night during the early years of my career, The place where I recovered after the hospital treatments. The place where I built the professional reputation that eventually led to the letter sitting in my folder. Now it was about to become something else. A closing chapter. I placed the leather folder on the desk and opened it one more time. Inside were the same documents that had quietly rewritten the family narrative tonight. Hospital receipts, trust fund ledger, investment transfer record, audit trail, apartment guarantee release, and finally, the appointment letter from Nordic Global Finance Group. I looked at each page slowly, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just recognition. For years, those papers had represented unanswered questions. Now they were simply records, complete ones. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Emily. One last thing. I sat down at the desk and read the next line. Mom didn't argue tonight. She rarely admits when she's wrong. But she didn't argue. That was true. My mother had tried to redirect the conversation early in the evening, but once the documents aligned, she had chosen not to fight the evidence, which in its own way was a form of acknowledgement. I typed back. She understood the numbers. Emily responded. Still, tonight felt different. Yes, it had. For years, the family story had quietly placed me in a certain role. The struggling child, the one who needed help, the one whose successes always came with a quiet footnote about parental support. That version of the story was gone now. Not erased through confrontation, just corrected. Another message appeared. Daniel again. By the way, Dad stayed behind for a minute after you left. That made me pause. Really? Yes. He went back inside the restaurant to talk to the manager. About the bill? No. Daniel's next message arrived. He asked if the restaurant had a copy machine. I frowned slightly. Why? Daniel's response came a moment later. He made a copy of the agreement you had him sign. I leaned back in the chair thinking about that. Then another message appeared. I think he wanted a record too. That detail made sense. My father had always respected documentation, and tonight had shown him just how powerful records could be. Daniel sent one final message. Anyway, good luck in London, my friend. The family might not say it often, but we're proud of you. I typed back. Thank you. Then the apartment grew quiet again. Outside the window, the canal water reflected the last passing lights of the night. The folder remained open on the desk, but something about it felt different now. For years it had been preparation. Tonight it had been closure. And tomorrow it would just be paperwork again. The kind accountants store away once the ledger finally balances. But before closing the folder, I noticed one small thing I hadn't looked at yet. Tucked behind the appointment letter was a simple envelope. Plain white, no official letterhead. Just my name written in my father's handwriting. I didn't remember seeing him place it there, which meant he must have slipped it into the folder when no one was looking. And suddenly I realized the evening might not be completely finished yet. Part 24. For a moment, I simply stared at the envelope. It rested quietly behind the appointment letter, almost easy to miss if I hadn't been looking carefully. Plain white. My name written across the front in my father's handwriting. There was no stamp, no seal, nothing formal about it. Just a folded piece of paper placed deliberately where I would find it later, which meant he had slipped it into the folder sometime during the dinner, probably while everyone else had been focused on the cake or the conversation. I picked it up slowly. The paper felt ordinary, the kind people keep in desk drawers for quick notes. For several seconds, I considered leaving it unopened until morning, but curiosity has always been difficult for accountants to ignore. I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was unmistakably his, direct, precise. Patrick, I didn't want to say this at the table tonight, not because it shouldn't be said, but because family audiences have a way of turning honest conversations into performances. Tonight you showed everyone something I should have recognized years ago. You don't need the family story to succeed. You built your own. When the trust fund was moved into the investment account, I convinced myself it was simply a financial decision, At the time, I believed it would strengthen the family as a whole. But success has a strange way of rewriting how we remember our choices. Over the years, it became easier to believe the version of events where we had supported you more than we actually had. Tonight, you corrected that record. You did it calmly. You did it professionally. And you did it without trying to take anything from anyone. That takes discipline, more than most people realize. London will suit you, not just because of the position, but because you've proven that you understand something many successful people never learn. Reputation is not built by controlling stories, it's built by letting the facts stand on their own. I won't pretend tonight was comfortable for me, but it was fair. And fairness matters. You once asked me many years ago why I respected numbers more than opinions. The answer is simple. Numbers eventually reveal the truth. Tonight they did. Good luck in London. Dad, I read the letter twice, not because the words were complicated, but because they were something I had rarely seen from him before. Unfiltered honesty. No explanations layered over the facts. No attempt to reshape the narrative. Just acknowledgement. I folded the letter again and placed it back in the envelope. Then I leaned back in the chair and looked out the window toward the canal. The city had grown completely quiet now. The water moved slowly beneath the streetlights, reflecting the same calm rhythm that had carried me through most of my adult life. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like if the truth about the trust fund ever surfaced. I had imagined arguments, bitterness, distance. But the real ending had been much simpler. A dinner, some documents, a few signatures, and a quiet correction of the story everyone thought they knew. The folder on my desk was still open. The hospital receipts sat neatly on top. Beneath them, the trust ledger, the audit trail, the signed apartment release, and the letter confirming my new role in London. For years, those papers had been pieces of an unfinished puzzle. Now they were just records, closed ones. I slipped the envelope from my father between the pages of the appointment letter, not as evidence, just as something worth keeping. Then I closed the folder. The click of the clasp sounded small in the quiet apartment, but it carried the same meaning the entire evening had been moving toward. The ledger was balanced, the story was accurate, and the next chapter could finally begin.